One man conquered more of Europe than anyone since the Romans, then lost it all in just 2 years. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from broke artillery officer to master of a continent, commanding the largest army ever assembled. But what nobody tells you is how his greatest victory contained the seeds of his ultimate destruction, and why his defeat actually spread his ideas faster than his conquest ever did. You'll discover the shocking truth behind history's most dramatic rise and fall, including the 3 fatal mistakes that destroyed an empire and the unexpected way his legacy still controls your daily life. The blade falls. Louis XVI is dead. In Vienna, London, Berlin, and St. Petersburg, monarchs touch their own necks as the news travels through diplomatic pouches sealed with trembling wax. The French Republic has killed God's anointed. This cannot stand. Still, from the scaffold's blood emerges something unprecedented in European warfare: the nation in arms. While crowned heads count their guards and sharpen their swords, France transforms itself into a weapon forged from revolutionary fury and administrative genius. The old world of professional armies and cabinet wars dies with the king. What rises from its ashes will devour the continent. Lazare Carnot stands in his austere office at the Committee of Public Safety, maps covering every surface like battle scars across Europe. The organizer of victory works 18-hour days, his pen scratching across requisition orders that will summon forth armies from the very stones of France. Behind wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes hold the cold fire of a mathematician, calculating the precise force needed to shatter empires. The levée en masse conscripts 750,000 men in a single decree. Not since the barbarian migrations has Europe witnessed such mobilization. Village blacksmiths hammer plowshares into bayonets while their sons march away singing the Marseillaise. In Brittany, peasants who have never seen Paris shoulder muskets for the Republic. From Normandy to Provence, an entire people rises to defend revolution against the crowned vultures gathering beyond their borders. Aristocrat officers flee across frontiers or face the guillotine's embrace, their elegant swordwork no match for revolutionary justice. In their place rise sergeants who can read maps and show courage under fire. Men like Joachim Murat, son of an innkeeper, whose cavalry charges will one day shake European battlefields. The terror reshapes the officer corps with surgical precision. Those who survive are those who win. Blood pools in Toulon's muddy streets as British ships anchor in the harbour, their Union Jacks snapping in the Mediterranean wind. The royalist city has opened its gates to France's enemies, offering them the Republic's greatest naval base. For 3 days, autumn rain turns the siege works into a maze of trenches where desperate men crouch behind earthworks, waiting for someone to break the deadlock. Through this, hell walks a skeletal figure whose uniform hangs loose on his angular frame. Captain Napoleon Bonaparte ignores musket balls whining overhead as he sights his guns personally, his mathematician's mind calculating angles while his hands adjust elevation screws slick with rainwater and blood. He sleeps beside his cannons, shares his soldiers' soggy bread, and speaks to them in the patois of common men, rather than the polished phrases of the military academy. The breakthrough comes at dawn on December the 17th, 1793. Bonaparte's batteries have been repositioned during the night, a feat his enemies thought impossible in the face of British naval guns. The first salvo catches the enemy ships at anchor, iron balls skipping across the harbour, like stones thrown by an angry giant. Within hours, the British fleet cuts its cables and flees, leaving Toulon's defenders to face Republican justice alone. Victory transforms the unknown Corsican into the Republic's youngest general at 24. In the cafes of Paris, Men speak of the little corporal who seized Toulon through audacity and mathematical precision. His name appears in dispatches that reach the Directory, though few can pronounce it correctly. Bonaparte, a foreign sound for a foreign man in a nation discovering its own terrible power. But the terror devours its own children with mechanized efficiency. Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, watches his enemies mount the scaffold until that July morning when the crowd turns and he finds himself facing the same blade. The revolutionary machinery that consumed kings and aristocrats claims its architect, and France staggers drunkenly toward whatever comes next. In the chaos following Robespierre's fall, royalist conspirators emerge like rats from the sewers. They remember Louis XVII, the boy who died in Temple prison, and dream of restoration under his uncle, the self-styled Louis XVIII. Their agent, the Count of Brottier, weaves plots while émigré armies mass beyond the Rhine, waiting for the signal to reclaim their stolen inheritance. October 5th, 1795. The royalist sections of Paris rise in coordinated rebellion. Their leaders convinced the Republic is finally collapsing under its own contradictions. Armed bands converge on the Tuileries Palace, while church bells ring across the capital, not for celebration, but as signals for insurrection. The Directory's defenders seem outnumbered, outgunned, and demoralized by months of political chaos. General Bonaparte stands in the courtyard of the military academy, watching his gunners maneuver their pieces through narrow streets with practiced efficiency. 40 cannons trained on the church of Saint-Roch, where royalist rebels have taken position. The crowd surges forward, their voices raised in songs of the old monarchy, their banners displaying the fleur-de-lis that has not flown over Paris for 3 years. "Citizens," the general calls to his artillerymen, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You have 5 minutes to clear the square." The guns speak with unified voice, a whiff of grape shot that scatters the rebellion like leaves before a hurricane. Bodies litter the church steps while survivors flee through side streets, their dreams of restoration bleeding into the cobblestones. In a single morning's work, Bonaparte has saved the Republic and announced himself as its sword. The Italian command falls to him like ripe fruit in 1796. The army of Italy, 30,000 scarecrows in rags, some barefoot, many sharing weapons between them, receives a new commander who stands before them, speaking not of glory, but of bread, not of honor, but of silver. "Soldiers," he tells them, "you are naked and ill-fed. I am going to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power." His innovation transforms European warfare itself. Armies that live off the land rather than dragging supply trains across mountain passes. Speed becomes weapon, mobility becomes strategy. The ragged soldiers who could barely march now cover impossible distances, appearing where Austrian generals least expect them, while their own ponderous formations are still deploying from winter quarters. Austrian commanders, trained in the geometrical warfare of Frederick the Great, face something beyond their comprehension. At Montenotte, their carefully planned offensive crumbles when Bonaparte divides his army, a violation of every military maxim, and strikes both enemy wings simultaneously. At Lodi, his guns shatter Austrian formations crossing the bridge while he personally sights the cannons, earning the nickname that will follow him to St. Helena, the Little Corporal. Through Alpine passes, where Hannibal once led elephants, French columns pour into the Lombard plain like water through a broken dam. Milan opens its gates without a shot fired. Venice watches nervously as revolutionary armies approach the shores of her lagoon. the ancient order of northern Italy dissolves as swiftly as spring snow, replaced by republics that bear French names and sing revolutionary songs. Gold flows northward in wagons guarded by cavalry, not the king's gold or the aristocrats' hoarded treasures, but the accumulated wealth of centuries liberated by revolutionary force. Churches yield up their plate, palaces their art, banks their reserves. The army of Italy grows rich while the Directory's empty coffers fill with Italian silver. But victory brings complications that no military academy teaches. In the marble palaces of Venice, ancient senators who remember the Republic's golden age watch French soldiers with expressions that mix contempt with calculation. The Pope himself sends envoys from Rome, His Holiness suddenly discovering Republican virtues when French bayonets approach his temporal borders. Europe watches and calculates. In the Hofburg, Emperor Francis II studies maps that show French armies approaching his hereditary domains. From London, British gold flows to any prince willing to take French steel, though few remain eager after witnessing the fate of the First Coalition. The young republic has announced itself not through diplomatic protocol, but through the thunder of its cannons and the precision of its mathematics. Meanwhile, in the coffee houses of Paris, citizens read bulletins that transform their unknown Corsican general into a hero worthy of ancient Rome. His victories echo the conquests of Caesar, though fought for liberty rather than empire. The Directory itself begins to fear the very weapon it has forged. A general whose popularity rivals that of governments, whose soldiers worship him more than the Republic itself. By 1797, the man who had stood before his ragged army 2 years earlier now commands the loyalty of veterans who have seen Rome and walked through the galleries of confiscated palaces. They call him Le Petit Caporal, but their voices carry the devotion once reserved for kings. In their knapsacks they carry not just Italian gold, but something more dangerous: the knowledge that under this general's leadership nothing seems impossible. The revolution has created its instrument of expansion. What Europe does not yet understand is that the instrument is developing ambitions that transcend revolutionary ideology. On the battlefields of Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte has discovered not just his military genius, but his political destiny. The artillery officer who saved the Republic is already dreaming of replacing it. 400 ships slip through Mediterranean fog on a May morning in 1798, their sails ghostly white against the pewter sky. The armada carries 38,000 men toward a destination so secret that even the generals sealed in their cabins can only guess at their fate. Aboard the flagship L'Orient, Napoleon Bonaparte studies charts by candlelight, while his secretary transcribes orders to commanders who will not read them until the die is cast. The fleet's human cargo defies every convention of military expedition. Alongside veteran grenadiers who storm the bridges at Lodi March, 167 of France's finest minds, mathematicians, astronomers, botanists, artists, engineers. In the hold of La Couronne, Claude Berthollet's chemical apparatus rattles against Gaspard Monge's surveying instruments, while Dominique Vivant-Denon sketches the profiles of common soldiers who will soon walk among Pharaoh's tombs. Admiral Nelson's hunting squadrons prowl these waters like sharks sensing blood, their weathered hulls cutting through swells as British lookouts scan every horizon for the French fleet that has vanished from Toulon. The one-eyed sailor commands 14 ships of the line, and an obsession that borders on madness. Find Bonaparte's armada and destroy it before whatever mischief the Corsican intends can unfold. Malta surrenders without firing a shot, its ancient knights too few and too old to resist French steel. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch signs the capitulation in his palace, while French soldiers already occupy the harbour, their tricolour banners snapping above ramparts that have defied Ottoman fleets for centuries. The island's treasures, gold accumulated through 800 years of Mediterranean commerce, flow into French coffers like water into desert sand. When the fleet turns south from Malta's limestone cliffs, truth spreads through the ranks like fever. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the path to British India. In the troop ships, veterans who have marched from the Rhine to the Tiber now contemplate a campaign beyond their wildest imagination. Some cross themselves and pray to saints whose names they learned in Norman villages. Others sharpen their bayonets and dream of eastern gold. The landing at Alexandria unfolds in pre-dawn darkness as boats heavy with armed men ground themselves on beaches where Alexander the Great once walked. French soldiers, dressed for European warfare in wool uniforms and leather stocks, stumble through surf onto sand that burns their feet through worn boot leather. The ancient port's inhabitants wake to find tricolour flags flying above their minarets, while foreign cannon mouth their harbour walls. Heat becomes the expedition's first enemy, more deadly than Mamluk steel or British sea power. The march from Alexandria to Cairo stretches across 3 weeks of hell that test endurance more severely than any European campaign. Men drink their own urine when water runs out. Horses collapse with foam on their lips. The sick and wounded ride in jolting carts while ravens circle overhead like harbingers of imperial doom. Desert mirages mock the suffering columns as shimmering lakes appear and vanish in the distance, their false promise driving men to madness. Soldiers who have stormed the heights of Rivoli now stumble through sand dunes, their muskets too hot to touch, their tongues swollen black with thirst. Behind them, a trail of graves marked with makeshift crosses stretches back toward the Mediterranean, like stations of a cavalry. Bedouin raiders strike at dawn and dusk, their camels flowing across the sand like shadows given deadly form. French squares bristling with bayonets provide some protection, but the harassment never ceases. Sentries die with arrows through their throats. Supply wagons burn in the night. Isolated men simply vanish without trace into the vastness that swallows European certainties. But the general who leads this suffering host speaks to his men of Alexander and Caesar, of immortal glory that awaits those brave enough to seize it. At evening halt, when the squares form around precious wells, Bonaparte walks among his soldiers, sharing their brackish water and stale bread. His voice carries across the desert night, promising that their names will live forever in the annals of great deeds. July 21st, 1798. The pyramids of Giza rise from the plateau like monuments to eternity itself, their ancient stones golden in the morning sun. Before them, 10,000 Mamluk horsemen deploy in formations that would have made Saladin weep with pride. Each warrior bears weapons worth a king's ransom: Damascus steel inlaid with silver, mails forged in the workshops of Cairo, horses bred in the pastures of the Nile Delta. Murad Bey commands these magnificent fighters, his own armor blazing with gems that catch the sunlight like captured stars. For 40 years, the Mamluk lords have ruled Egypt as warrior princes, their cavalry charges breaking every enemy who dared challenge their supremacy. They have never faced European infantry formed in mathematical precision, never tested their medieval splendor against revolutionary geometry. French soldiers form squares as solid as the monuments behind them, their bayonets creating walls of steel that no cavalry can breach. Inside these human fortresses, veterans who learned their trade in the muddy fields of Belgium and the rocky passes of Italy prepare to face death. in formations their drill sergeants hammered into their bones. The eternal confrontation between discipline and courage, system and heroism, unfolds beneath the pharaoh's gaze. The charge comes with earth-shaking thunder as 10,000 hooves drum against sand and stone. Silk banners stream in the desert wind, while Mamluk war cries echo off the ancient pyramids. Individual warriors worth more in gold than entire French companies hurl themselves against formations that bend but never break, their courage magnificent and ultimately futile against the mathematics of modern war. Carnage litters the plateau as medieval splendor dies beneath volleys delivered with mechanical precision. Mamluk horses scream and fall while their riders tumble into sand already dark with blood. In 1 hour, the warrior princes who have ruled the Nile for centuries lose 2,000 dead. The Republican forces count 30 casualties. Cairo's gates open without another shot fired. August 1st. Admiral Nelson finally discovers the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, their hulls dark silhouettes against the Egyptian coast. Admiral Brueys has positioned his ships in a line, confident that the shoal water between his anchorage and the shore makes attack from that direction impossible. 13 ships of the line swing at anchor, while their crews prepare for battle that most believe will never come. The British attack unfolds with tactical brilliance that will be studied for centuries. Captain Thomas Foley leads Goliath between the enemy line and the shore, accomplishing what Brueys thought impossible by threading his ship through waters barely deep enough to float her keel. Ship after ship follows this desperate course until half the British fleet has passed inside the Republican position. Caught between two fires, Bonaparte's ships die one by one as British broadsides tear through hulls and rigging with methodical fury. The roar of cannon echoes across the delta, while muzzle flashes turn night into flickering day. On Lorient's quarterdeck, Admiral Brueys refuses to abandon his position, even as British shot tears away his legs. He dies lashed to his chair, sword in hand, while his flagship burns around him. At 9:47 p.m., Lorient explodes with a blast that silences every gun in both fleets. The flagship's magazine detonates in a fireball visible from Alexandria, hurling debris so high that burning timbers fall like meteors into the sea. The concussion shatters windows 20 miles away, while the flash illuminates pyramids on the distant horizon. For 10 minutes, awed silence hangs over the bay, as sailors in both fleets comprehend the magnitude of what they have witnessed. Dawn reveals disaster absolute. 11 Republican ships destroyed or captured, their smoking hulks littering the bay like broken toys. Admiral Nelson, wounded but victorious, surveys carnage that has eliminated Bonaparte's naval power in a single night. The army that conquered Cairo now finds itself trapped in a land bounded by British-controlled waters and hostile desert. Yet from military disaster comes cultural triumph beyond any conqueror's wildest dreams. The scholars who accompanied the expedition begin work that will revolutionize human understanding of ancient civilizations. In the ruins of Memphis and Thebes, Republican mathematicians measure monuments with scientific precision, while artists record hieroglyphs that have puzzled mankind for millennia. 1799 brings the Syrian nightmare as Bonaparte leads 13,000 men across the Sinai toward Ottoman strongholds that command the road to Constantinople. The march through desert proves even more brutal than the advance on Cairo, with water sources poisoned and supplies scattered across hundreds of miles of wasteland. Men die of thirst within sight of the Mediterranean, while their comrades press forward toward a destiny that grows darker with each passing day. Jaffa's siege ends in massacre, that haunts even hardened veterans. 3,000 Ottoman prisoners die beneath Republican bayonets on beaches still red with their blood. The general who ordered their execution claims military necessity. His army lacks food and water to maintain captives. But the slaughter creates stains that no victory can wash clean. Bonaparte's officers who witnessed Italian triumphs now watch their commander cross lines that separate war from atrocity. Acre's walls rise from the Palestinian coast like a stone rebuke to imperial ambition. Behind those ramparts waits Ahmad al-Jazar, the butcher of Acre, whose cruelty rivals that of any European tyrant. Beside him stands Sir Sidney Smith, the British Commodore, whose naval guns and military engineers transform Ottoman determination into impregnable defense. The city that should have fallen in days withstands siege for 2 months. Plague arrives with the spring heat, striking down men already weakened by poor food and constant fighting. Bubonic swellings appear in groins and armpits, while fever burns through minds that once calculated the trajectories of cannonballs. The army that dreamed of marching to India now struggles to survive each day, as disease proves more deadly than enemy fire. The retreat becomes a death march across landscapes that seem cursed by divine wrath. Plague victims receive opium overdoses to spare them capture, their bodies left beside the road like milestones marking the expedition's failure. Officers who led charges at the pyramids now stumble through sand dunes, their uniforms reduced to rags, their dreams of Eastern Empire buried in Palestinian graves. But a common soldier using a black stone to shore up fortifications near Rosetta makes a discovery that will unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt. The trilingual inscription, hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, provides the key that Jean-François Champollion will use 20 years later to decipher the pharaoh's lost language. Military defeat births scholarly triumph that enriches human knowledge for all time. October 15th, 1799. Newspapers smuggled from Europe reveal the Directory's disasters and Austria's renewed attacks. France loses battles while her greatest general remains trapped beside the Nile, his army slowly melting away through disease and desertion. Bonaparte reads dispatches by candlelight in his quarters at Cairo, calculating odds that grow worse with every passing week. On August 23rd, 1799, the man who promised his soldiers immortal glory abandons them to their fate. A fast frigate slips from Alexandria harbor under cover of darkness, carrying the general and his chosen few toward France, while 30,000 men face death or surrender in the land they conquered for him. General Kleber, left in command, curses his departed chief in language that would blister paint. The abandoned army will surrender in 1801. Its survivors repatriated to a France that barely remembers their sacrifice. But their leader sails toward destiny, his mind already calculating the political opportunities that military disaster has unexpectedly created. Behind him, the ancient land keeps its secrets, while tricolour scholars continue their work among monuments that will outlast every empire built by mortal hands. Egyptian sands buried another conqueror's ambition, yet from those same sands emerged treasures of immeasurable worth. The Rosetta Stone, vast records of Egypt, a flood of knowledge awakening worlds long silent. What faltered in battle triumphed in culture, proving that discovery, unlike conquest, leaves legacies that time cannot erase. October 1799. Napoleon Bonaparte lands at Fréjus on a grey dawn that transforms into golden triumph before the sun reaches its zenith. Word spreads faster than wildfire through the coastal towns. The Corsican is back. The victor of Italy has returned from the east, abandoning his army, but bringing with him the mystique of conquest. and the promise of salvation for a nation drowning in military disasters and political chaos. The journey to Paris becomes a procession worthy of Caesar returning from Gaul. At every village, mayors emerge with hastily prepared speeches, their hands trembling as they present keys to a man whose reputation has grown beyond all proportion during his Egyptian absence. The crowds that gather speak not of the disasters at Acre or the abandoned soldiers beside the Nile, but of Rivoli and Arcola, of the pyramids and the mysterious East. They cheer the conqueror of Italy. The Egyptian debacle remains a carefully guarded secret. Through Provence's autumn landscape, the general's coach rolls between ranks of common people who have travelled miles to glimpse the hero whose name fills the dispatches. Veterans on half-pay salute as he passes, their weathered faces brightening with hope that their sacrifices might yet find meaning. Women throw flowers while their children crane necks to see the small man whose legend has already outgrown his physical presence. At Lyon, the reception explodes into something approaching religious fervour. The city that has suffered through radical terror and counter-radical reprisals sees in Napoleon's return the possibility of stability, of order, without oppression. Silk merchants who have watched their trade collapse during the Directory's wars whisper that perhaps this general might restore prosperity along with glory. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Directory watches the commander's approach with emotions that mix relief and terror in equal measure. Paul Barras, the corrupt politician who has survived every political convulsion through adaptability and cunning, recognizes both opportunity and threat in the Corsican's return. The government needs a sword to restore order, but swords have a tendency to turn on their wielders. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès embodies the intellectual crisis of Republican France. The abbé who wrote What is the Third Estate and helped design the revolutionary constitution now searches desperately for a formula that might preserve republican ideals while providing the strong leadership that the nation obviously requires. His famous phrase, "I am looking for a sword," will soon find its answer in the ambitious general approaching the capital. Word reaches the Tuileries that Bonaparte has entered the city during the dark hours before dawn on October 16th. By morning, his modest house on the Rue de la Victoire becomes the center of Parisian politics as visitors stream through doors that can barely contain the flood of office seekers, conspirators, and genuine patriots. The general receives them all with studied simplicity, wearing civilian dress that cannot quite disguise his military bearing. Josephine weeps in her husband's arms, though observers note that her tears seem more calculated than spontaneous. The Creole beauty has survived her husband's absence by accumulating debts, lovers, and political connections with equal enthusiasm. Her reunion with the first consul combines genuine affection with careful positioning for whatever political upheavals might follow his return. The conspiracy that will destroy the Directory takes shape in drawing rooms where radical veterans meet with royalist sympathizers, united only in their disgust for a government that has brought the Republic nothing but defeat and corruption. Talleyrand, the bishop turned radical turned opportunist, weaves between factions with the skill of a spider, sensing vibrations throughout his web. His survival instincts, honed through every political crisis, tell him that change approaches on swift feet. November 9th, 1799. 18 Brumaire in the new calendar. The coup unfolds with theatrical precision that would shame professional actors. Lucien Bonaparte, the general's younger brother and president of the Council of 500, calls an emergency session at Saint-Cloud, ostensibly to protect the legislature from a non-existent Jacobin conspiracy. The fiction provides legal cover for what everyone understands to be political change. At Saint-Cloud, the plan nearly collapses into farce. Napoleon enters the Council of 500 expecting acclamation, but faces instead a mob of deputies shouting, "Outlaw!" and "Down with the tyrant." Hands reach for him, voices demand his arrest. The man who has faced Austrian cannons and Mamluk sabers staggers backward before the fury of elected representatives defending their constitutional prerogatives. Blood appears on the general's face. Whether from genuine injury or theatrical effect, historians still debate as he stumbles from the hall. The conqueror of Egypt seems bewildered by civilian hostility, his military genius useless against parliamentary procedure. For crucial minutes, the coup hangs in balance as deputies debate whether to declare Bonaparte an enemy of the state. Lucien saves his brother and French history with a gesture that combines legal knowledge and dramatic instinct. As president of the Assembly, he has the right to speak, and he uses it to point his sword at Napoleon's breast. "Citizens," he declares, in a voice that carries to every corner of the hall, "I swear that I will stab my own brother to the heart if he ever attempts anything against the liberty of Frenchmen." The performance succeeds brilliantly. Deputies who might have arrested the Corsican as a would-be dictator now see him as a patriot protected by his own brother's vigilance. When Lucien calls for the grenadiers to clear the hall of daggers and foreign pay, military discipline overrides civilian authority. Red plumes bob through doorways as soldiers march in while deputies scatter like leaves before autumn wind. Some leap through windows in their haste to escape, their dignity abandoned along with their legislative prerogatives. Others attempt to maintain constitutional forms, even as bayonets glitter around them. By evening, the Directory exists only on paper, while real power has passed to men who understand that the country requires surgery, not rhetoric. 3 consuls emerge to rule the nation, their names carefully chosen to echo Roman precedent while disguising the reality of personal authority. Napoleon becomes first consul, flanked by 2 colleagues whose obscurity emphasizes his own prominence. Roger Ducos and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès provide republican legitimacy, while everyone understands where decisions will originate. The new government moves immediately to the Tuileries Palace, where Louis XVI once lived and died. The first consul's study occupies rooms that have witnessed the monarchy's collapse, republican triumph, and now the birth of something unprecedented in European politics. A republic ruled by military genius. Maps cover walls that once displayed portraits of Bourbon ancestors, while dispatch riders carry orders that will reshape continental politics. 18-hour workdays become the commander's standard as he attacks the country's accumulated problems with the same systematic approach he once applied to Italian battlefields. 6 secretaries struggle to keep pace with his dictation, while messengers carry his decisions to prefects, generals, and diplomats across the continent. The energy that conquered northern Italy now turns to reconstructing the government. The prefect system replaces democratic chaos with administrative efficiency that would impress Roman emperors. The republic divides into departments, each governed by a centrally appointed administrator responsible directly to Paris. Local autonomy dies, replaced by uniform administration that extends central authority into every village and marketplace. The revolution's democratic experiments yield to professional competence. Securing peace with the church proves the consulate's crowning move, as Bonaparte signs the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. Catholicism is restored as the faith of the majority, while the state keeps control over clerical appointments. Doors of churches swing open again, priests step out from exile, and millions of believers worship freely without renouncing republican ideals. The bargain satisfies all parties through careful ambiguity. The The church recovers its buildings and legal status, while the state retains authority over episcopal appointments and clerical salaries. Catholics can practice their faith without appearing counter-republican, while Republicans can support a settlement that preserves state supremacy over religious authority. From Bonaparte's drive for order comes the Code Napoleon, a legal framework whose influence spreads far beyond France. Roman law principles merge with popular innovations to create standards that emphasize property rights, patriarchal authority, and civil equality. A man can divorce his wife for adultery, but she cannot divorce him for the same offense. All male children inherit equally, destroying aristocratic primogeniture while maintaining paternal control. The code's influence spreads far beyond national borders, as conquered territories adopt its provisions and independent nations study its principles. Legal uniformity replaces centuries of local custom, creating frameworks that facilitate both commerce and administration. The Republic's promise of equality before law finds concrete expression in systematic jurisprudence. With politics steadied, economic rebuilding takes center stage, as the consulate confronts crises lingering from years of turmoil. The Bank of the Republic establishes a stable currency and dependable credit, silver francs replacing the discredited assignats. For the first time since 1789, the state balances its budget, while efficient tax collection secures revenue for both recovery and war. The consulate's reorganization of schooling gives rise to the lycées, institutions designed to prepare the officials who will run the empire. Students absorb Latin and mathematics, but also discipline and loyalty, their training aimed at efficiency more than independence. In principle, the system rewards merit, though always within the framework of state service. Public works provide jobs for veterans and the jobless, while laying firmer economic foundations. Roads are rebuilt to speed both trade and armies, engineered with standards recalling Rome. Bridges knit together provinces once divided by rivers, and canals open inland towns to the sea. Material renewal advances in step with political change. With Fouché in command, policing becomes an art of surveillance, a system that penetrates every street, salon, and workshop. A man who shifted from priest to terrorist now offers the consulate his unmatched efficiency in rooting out opposition. Through his agents, the first consul receives an unending flow of intelligence on both public mood and secret plotting. While civilian reforms transform society, military preparations proceed in secret as Napoleon recognizes that war will determine his political survival. The army reserve assembles quietly in Dijon, its veterans drawn from other units without attracting foreign attention. When Austria inevitably breaks the fragile peace of Campo Formio, the Republic will be ready with forces that combine Italian experience with popular fervor. Acceptance abroad proves hesitant as European courts wrestle with a regime that blends Republican claims with unmistakably personal rule. Diplomats remark that the first consul wields powers exceeding those of many kings, yet cloaks them in Republican language that appeals to the French people. Such a mixture unsettles traditionalists, who prefer sharper lines between lawful monarchy and illegitimate usurpation. By spring 1800, the transformation appears complete. The Directory's chaos has yielded to systematic administration, religious persecution to negotiated settlement, military defeat to careful preparation for renewed conflict. The nation has discovered in Bonaparte the sword that Sieyès sought, though the blade shows signs of developing its own ambitions beyond mere service to republican ideology. The consulate's success creates its own problems, as the first consul's popularity makes him indispensable to a system supposedly based on collective leadership. His colleagues fade into insignificance, while his own authority grows with each administrative triumph and military victory. The Republic may have found its savior, but saviors have a tendency to become masters of those they rescue. On May 1800, Napoleon leads his army through the Great Saint Bernard Pass in a feat that defies both geography and military science. Artillery pieces travel in hollowed tree trunks, dragged by soldiers whose boots slip on ice that has claimed the lives of countless travelers. The Alps rise around them like the vertebrae of sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in clouds that seem to brush the very throne of God. Austrian commanders expect the French to advance along the coastal road through Nice, where conventional armies have marched for centuries. Instead, Bonaparte appears behind them like a thunderclap from clear skies, his troops emerging from mountain passes that Habsburg generals believed impassable for anything larger than a mule train. The strategic surprise transforms what should have been a grinding siege into a campaign of rapid movement and decisive battle. At Marengo, on June 14th, fortune nearly abandons the first consul as Austrian General Melas deploys 31,000 men against 28,000 French soldiers spread across the Lombard plain. By 3 p.m, defeat seems certain as Republican units retreat in disorder, while Habsburg cavalry charges shatter formations that have held firm through Italy's previous campaigns. Napoleon's bulletins will later claim he planned everything, but witnesses see a commander grappling with disaster. General Melas withdraws to headquarters for dinner, certain the day is won and leaving subordinates to chase the shattered French. His confidence is shattered when General Louis Desire arrives with 5,000 fresh troops, advancing toward the thunder of guns like salvation out of dust and smoke. This battle is completely lost, Desire remarks, but it is only 2 o'clock. There is time to win another. The transformation unfolds with shocking swiftness as Desire's men form line of battle, while French cavalry under General Kellerman charges into enemy flanks that had been pursuing defeated armies moments earlier. In 30 minutes, complete defeat becomes total victory as Austrian units disintegrate under pressure they had not expected to face. Desire dies in the moment of triumph, his body falling among the Habsburg dead, while his victory secures Republican dominance in northern Italy. The Peace of Amiens in March 1802 brings Europe its first respite from war in nearly a decade. For 14 months, the continent can breathe, while diplomats in London and Paris negotiate terms that satisfy no one completely, but exhaust everyone sufficiently. English tourists flood across the Channel to see Paris and its new master, their guidebooks describing a city transformed by revolutionary energy and imperial ambition. Bonaparte uses this interlude to consolidate power at home, while extending French influence into regions that had never seen tricolour banners. The expedition to Saint-Domingue under General Leclerc aims to restore Republican control over the Caribbean's richest colony. But yellow fever and Toussaint Louverture's resistance destroy 40,000 European soldiers in a graveyard that spans tropical islands. The disaster convinces the first consul to sell Louisiana to the Americans for $15 million, transforming the empire's New World territories into cash that funds European ambitions. Meanwhile, constitutional changes at home prepare the ground for transformations that will reshape European monarchy itself. The Senate, purged of opposition voices, declares Napoleon consul for life, with powers that differ from royal authority only in name. The plebiscite that follows produces 3.5 million votes in favour against 8,000 opposed, though observers note that ballot secrecy exists mainly in theory. December 2nd, 1804. Notre Dame Cathedral witnesses ceremonies that combine revolutionary innovation with monarchical tradition in spectacle that awes even those who oppose its implications. Pope Pius VII sits in the sanctuary, watching Napoleon take the crown from the altar and place it upon his own head, the gesture declaring that no earthly power, not even the Church, can grant what divine providence has already bestowed. Josephine kneels before her husband as he places the smaller crown upon her dark curls, tears streaming down cheeks that have known both West Indian slavery and European royalty. The Empress of the French rises to receive homage from marshals whose origins span the entire social spectrum. Former innkeepers and blacksmiths, now bearing titles that rival those of ancient nobility. Anxious eyes turn within the Holy Roman Empire as Francis II recognizes the impossibility of two emperors sharing Europe. Bonaparte's claim to imperial rank undermines pretensions to authority, maintained for 1,000 years. Protests fall silent in vain, leaving the issue to be settled by war. The Grande Armée assembles at Boulogne in 1803, its 200,000 men training for the invasion of England, while Bonaparte studies tide tables and designs landing craft, with the same attention he once devoted to artillery trajectories. "Let me be master of the Channel for 6 hours," he declares, "and I am master of the world." Across 22 miles of water, British preparations transform every beach into a fortress, while the Royal Navy maintains vigilant patrol. Admiral Nelson commands the Mediterranean fleet, with orders to find and destroy the French Navy before Bonaparte's invasion flotilla can cross the Channel. The one-armed sailor's pursuit of Admiral Villeneuve becomes a chase that spans continents, from Toulon to the West Indies and back to European waters, where British and Republican interests will collide with decisive power. The Army of England never sails, though its preparations terrify British leadership into desperate expedients. William Pitt returns to power in London, while European gold flows to any prince willing to take French steel. The Third Coalition forms as Austria, Russia, and Sweden unite with Britain in the last hope of containing Napoleon's expanding empire before tricolour eagles spread across the entire continent. August 1705 transforms everything when the emperor learns that Habsburg armies have invaded Bavaria, while Russian columns march westward through Poland. The threat to Republican allies cannot be ignored, while the opportunity to destroy enemy formations before they unite proves irresistible. On August 27th, the Grande Armée abandons its invasion camps and begins the march eastward that will culminate in some of military history's most brilliant campaigns. The speed of movement astounds even veteran observers as 7 corps advance along separate routes that converge on Habsburg positions with mathematical precision. In 30 days, imperial troops cover 500 miles while maintaining coordination that allows them to unite for battle or divide for supply as circumstances require. European warfare has never witnessed logistical planning on this scale or execution of such systematic perfection. October brings the campaign's masterstroke as Bonaparte's divisions encircle General Mack's army at Ulm before he grasps the peril. The trap is sprung by maneuvers that break every orthodox rule, yet deliver outcomes traditional generals deem unattainable. French corps emerge where scouts swear no enemy exists, their movements synchronized with the precision of machinery. General Mack commands 70,000 men and holds a fortress that should withstand any siege, yet finds himself trapped by formations that seem to materialize from empty countryside. The Habsburg generals' attempts to break out fail as imperial positions tighten around Ulm, like a noose drawn by invisible hands. By October 15th, surrender becomes the only alternative to starvation, though the capitulation shocks European courts with its completeness. 70,000 Austrian soldiers lay down their arms without fighting a major battle, their standards and artillery pieces becoming trophies that demonstrate Republican superiority in the art of war itself. The victory at Ulm eliminates Habsburg main strength, while leaving Napoleon free to advance against Russian armies that have marched too far west to retreat without battle. November brings imperial formations to Vienna as Emperor Francis flees his capital for the second time in a decade. The ancient city opens its gates to avoid bombardment, while its inhabitants watch tricolour banners rise above palaces where Habsburg emperors have ruled since the Middle Ages. Bonaparte establishes his headquarters in Schönbrunn Palace, sleeping in beds where his enemies have planned his destruction. But Tsar Alexander's army remains intact, united now with surviving Austrian units under the nominal command of Emperor Francis II. The Allied army totals 85,000 men, positioned on the Pratzen Heights near the village of Austerlitz, their commanders confident that superior numbers and strong positions guarantee victory over the upstart Corsican who has exceeded his proper station. December 2nd, 1805, first anniversary of the coronation. Napoleon deploys 73,000 men on the plain below enemy positions. His formations deliberately weakened on the right flank to tempt Allied commanders into attacks that will expose their own vulnerabilities. The tactical plan requires enemies to cooperate in their own destruction, a gamble that could prove fatal if Habsburg and Romanov generals refuse the bait. Dawn breaks cold and foggy as both armies prepare for battle that will determine Europe's political future. Thick mist fills the valleys, while soldiers on both sides peer through grey half-light, trying to distinguish friends from enemies, in conditions that reduce visibility to mere yards. The weather that seems to favour defence will prove crucial to Bonaparte's offensive plans. At 9 a.m., the sun burns through morning fog, in a meteorological display that Republican soldiers will remember as supernatural intervention on their emperor's behalf. The sun of Austerlitz illuminates the battlefield as Allied columns descend from the Pratzen Heights to attack the weak imperial right, exactly as the commander has hoped and planned. The battle unfolds like a chess problem solved by a master playing against amateurs. As Allied formations concentrate against the Republican right, Napoleon launches his central attack against the abandoned Pratzen Heights, his columns striking positions that enemy commanders have stripped to reinforce their assault. Marshal Soult's corps storms the heights, while Imperial artillery rakes Allied units caught in the valleys below. By afternoon, the Allied army disintegrates as formations find themselves cut off from retreat routes, while tricolour battalions control the heights they had occupied at dawn. Emperor Francis and Tsar Alexander flee the battlefield as their soldiers surrender or scatter across the frozen ponds that will claim hundreds of lives. Habsburg and Russian casualties total 27,000. Republican losses number fewer than 7,000. That evening, the emperor walks among the bodies, carpeting the battlefield, stepping carefully over Austrian grenadiers and Russian guardsmen, whose courage could not overcome mathematical superiority in position and movement. Torches carried by imperial soldiers, seeking wounded comrades, cast dancing shadows across faces that will never again see their native lands. This, Bonaparte tells his staff, has been the finest evening of my life. Triumph at Austerlitz secures Republican dominance across the continent and proves that the Corsican's generalship exceeds even his earlier triumphs. Austria bows to peace. Russia withdraws past Poland, and Britain remains alone to bankroll fresh coalitions. Armies bought with gold, but led without guarantee of skill. In the aftermath, European courts reassess their strategies, while Napoleon redistributes territories like a gambler dividing winnings. The Holy Roman Empire dies as Francis II abandons a title that has become meaningless, while German princes scramble to align themselves with imperial power before punishment falls upon those who resist inevitable change. From preparing a cross-channel invasion to commanding the heart of Europe, the emperor transforms the year, his eagles looming over monarchies that trusted ancient defenses. The fabric of the old order tears apart, replaced by one stitched together through bayonets and Bonaparte's brilliance. 2 weeks before Austerlitz, October 21st, 1805, the Atlantic roars off Cape Trafalgar. Nelson's 27 ships bear down on 33 Franco-Spanish opponents, autumn winds filling their sails as waves crash against hulls destined for history. Outnumbered but not outmaneuvered, the one-armed admiral stakes everything on revolutionary tactics designed for this single decisive hour. Traditional naval warfare demands that fleets form parallel lines and exchange broadsides until one side breaks or retreats. Nelson divides his forces into 2 columns, driving straight into the enemy formation like daggers thrust between ribs. HMS Victory leads one column, while Royal Sovereign spearheads the other, their captains understanding that this maneuver violates every orthodox principle while offering the possibility of annihilating rather than merely defeating the Franco-Spanish fleet. Standing on Victory's quarterdeck, the admiral wears his full dress uniform, with every medal and decoration blazing in the morning sun. His officers beg him to remove the insignia that make him an obvious target for enemy marksmen, but Nelson refuses to hide his identity in the hour of supreme trial. "In honor I gained them," he declares, "and in honor I will die with them." The melee that follows surpasses in violence anything European waters have witnessed since the Spanish Armada. Ships lock together gunwale to gunwale, their crews fighting with cutlass and pistol across decks slippery with blood and littered with dismembered limbs. Marines fire muskets from fighting tops, while gunners ram charges home with mechanical precision, their cannon heating red-hot from constant discharge. From the mizzen mast of Redoutable, a French marksman takes careful aim at the British admiral, whose uniform makes him unmistakable among the smoke and chaos. The musket ball strikes Nelson in the left shoulder, passes through his lung, and lodges in his spine. The man who has commanded British fleets for 20 years falls to Victory's deck, his blood mingling with that of common sailors who die for causes they barely understand. Carried below to the cockpit, where surgeons work by lantern light, Nelson lives long enough to learn that his tactical genius has achieved complete triumph. 17 enemy ships strike their colours, while not a single British vessel is lost, the victory so overwhelming that Franco-Spanish naval power ceases to exist as an effective force. "Thank God I have done my duty," the dying admiral whispers as cannon fire gradually fades above his head. The disaster at Trafalgar eliminates any possibility of invading Britain while establishing Royal Navy supremacy that will endure until steel replaces wood and steam supplants sail. Bonaparte's dreams of crossing the Channel die with Admiral Villeneuve's fleet, though the Emperor himself has already turned eastward, toward enemies who can be reached by marching feet rather than sailing ships. 1806 brings Prussia into the war against France, ending a decade of profitable neutrality that has allowed Frederick the Great's successors to watch their rivals exhaust themselves in revolutionary conflicts. The Holy Roman Empire's dissolution and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, German states under direct imperial control, finally convince Prussian leadership that accommodation with Bonaparte has become impossible. Queen Louise of Prussia embodies her nation's martial spirit as she rides through Berlin, wearing military uniform and urging her subjects to resist the Corsican upstart who has dared to reshape German politics without consulting Europe's most formidable military power. Her beauty and courage inspire poets, while her political influence pushes King Frederick William III toward confrontation with an enemy whose military reputation she dismisses as mere propaganda. The Prussian army that marches toward French positions carries the prestige of Frederick the Great's victories and the confidence of officers who believe European warfare has changed little since the 7 Years' War. Their formations move with mechanical precision, their drill reaches perfection through decades of practice, and their discipline surpasses that of any European military establishment. Yet they are about to discover that revolutionary warfare requires innovations their traditions have never contemplated. October 14th, 1806, twin battles unfold simultaneously as the Grande Armée encounters Prussian divisions at Jena and Auerstedt, engagements that will destroy in a single day the military reputation that Prussia has spent 50 years building. At Jena, Napoleon commands 96,000 men against what he believes to be the main enemy concentration, though fog and confusion have led him to attack a secondary force under Prince Hohenlohe. 20 miles away at Auerstedt, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout leads his single corps of 26,000 veterans against the true Prussian main body, 63,000 men under the Duke of Brunswick himself. The engagement violates every principle of orthodox strategy, as outnumbered Republican forces defeat superior numbers through tactical flexibility and individual initiative that Prussian commanders cannot match. At Jena, Imperial artillery tears gaps in enemy formations, while cavalry charges shatter units that have trained for warfare that no longer exists. Prussian discipline, so effective against Frederick's enemies, proves inadequate against soldiers who combine Republican enthusiasm with professional competence. By afternoon, Prince Hohenlohe's army dissolves into panic-stricken flight as survivors flee toward Weimar and beyond. Davout's triumph at Auerstedt surpasses even his emperor's achievement, as the Iron Marshal's veterans destroy the army of Frederick the Great through superior marksmanship, aggressive maneuvering, and unshakable determination. The Duke of Brunswick dies leading a futile cavalry charge, while King Frederick William flees the field, leaving behind artillery, standards, and the reputation that Prussia will spend 6 years trying to recover. By evening, the military monarchy that once made Europe tremble has ceased to exist as an effective force. Prussian casualties exceed 25,000, while Republican losses total fewer than 7,000. The disparity reflecting not merely tactical superiority, but the transformation of warfare itself. The age of limited conflicts and professional armies dies in German mud, replaced by total war that mobilizes entire populations. Bonaparte enters Berlin on October 27th, riding through Brandenburg Gate, while Prussian civilians watch in stunned silence from windows and doorways. The conqueror of Austerlitz now occupies the palace where Frederick the Great once planned campaigns that made Prussia a European power. His pilgrimage to the royal tomb at Potsdam produces one of history's most memorable observations. "Hats off, gentlemen. If he were alive, we would not be here." Winter 1806-07 transforms the pursuit of Russian armies into an ordeal that tests imperial endurance as severely as any previous campaign. Roads dissolve into mud that swallows wagons and lames horses, while supply lines stretch across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Grande Armée, designed for rapid movement and decisive battles, adapts slowly to grinding warfare in landscapes that seem designed to exhaust invading forces. At Eylau, on February 8, 1807, two armies clash in a blizzard that reduces visibility to mere yards while snow fills musket barrels and freezes gunpowder solid. Soldiers fire at shadows in the white chaos, their volleys echoing strangely through air thick with falling flakes. Cavalry charges disappear into frozen oblivion, while artillery crews work their guns by touch rather than sight. The battle produces 25,000 casualties without decisive result, its carnage shocking an emperor accustomed to victories that combine economy of force with strategic gain. Walking among bodies that lie frozen in grotesque positions, Napoleon observes to his staff, "This spectacle is calculated to inspire princes with love of peace and hatred of war." The comment reveals growing awareness that unlimited ambition may exact costs beyond calculation. Spring brings better weather, and the decisive encounter at Friedland on June 14th, 1807. Russian General Bennigsen positions his army with the Aller River at his back, committing the elementary error of restricting his own retreat, while offering his opponent the possibility of complete annihilation. Bonaparte recognizes the opportunity immediately, deploying his forces to exploit enemy vulnerability with mathematical precision. Imperial artillery concentrates on the bridges that provide the only escape routes, while infantry assaults pin Russian forces in positions where they can neither advance nor retreat effectively. The slaughter continues for hours as enemy soldiers attempt to cross narrow spans under direct fire, their bodies falling into water that runs red with blood. Russian casualties exceed 20,000, while French losses remain minimal. The victory so complete that Tsar Alexander must seek immediate peace. July 7th, 1807. A raft moored in the middle of the Niemen River becomes the setting for negotiations that will redraw the map of Europe according to imperial ambition and Russian pragmatism. Two emperors meet on neutral water, where neither can claim advantage of position, their conversation determining the fate of millions who have no voice in decisions that will govern their lives for years to come. The embrace between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander appears genuine as the autocrat falls under the spell of Bonaparte's charisma and intellectual brilliance. They discuss philosophy and literature as well as politics, their conversations lasting for hours while Frederick William III of Prussia waits uninvited on the riverbank, like a supplicant seeking mercy from his superiors. The treaties of Tilsit create a new European order based on Franco-Russian partnership and Prussian humiliation. Alexander agrees to join the Continental system against British trade, while recognizing imperial control over German territories. Prussia loses half its kingdom, including all lands west of the Elbe River, while its army is reduced to 42,000 men and forbidden to maintain fortresses east of the Oder. The Duchy of Warsaw emerges from Prussian losses as a restored Polish state, under Saxon rule but French protection. Its creation inspiring Polish patriots while terrifying every government that has participated in the partitions of 1772, 1793, and 1795. The resurrection of Poland, even in truncated form, suggests that Bonaparte's ambitions extend beyond mere territorial conquest to include the reorganization of European ethnicity itself. Europe seems conquered as imperial eagles cast shadows across kingdoms that had appeared secure behind ancient privileges and traditional alliances. Satellite monarchies rule territories from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Louis Bonaparte governs Holland. Jerome commands Westphalia. Joseph administers Naples before moving to Spain, while Caroline and Joachim Murat reign over Naples in his place. Only Britain remains at war, its gold subsidizing future coalitions that may never find leaders willing to challenge French supremacy. The men who conquered Europe with Napoleon receive rewards that transform revolutionary soldiers into imperial nobility. 26 marshals of the empire share fortunes that rival those of ancient aristocracy, while maintaining the meritocratic ideals that distinguish them from hereditary privilege. Michel Ney, son of a barrel cooper, becomes Duke of Elchingen. Joachim Murat, whose father operated an inn, marries the emperor's sister and ascends the throne of Naples. Some marshals deserve their elevation through military brilliance that would honor any army in any age. Louis-Nicolas Davout, the Iron Marshal, never loses a battle while maintaining discipline that makes his corps the Grande Armée's most reliable formation. André Masséna, the child of victory, demonstrates defensive genius that enables him to hold seemingly hopeless positions until relief arrives, or enemies exhaust themselves against his improvised fortifications. Others receive advancement through loyalty rather than competence, their devotion to Bonaparte compensating for tactical limitations that become apparent only in independent command. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte's appointment as Crown Prince of Sweden will ultimately produce the greatest betrayal the emperor suffers, while Nicolas Soult's ambitions in Spain create difficulties that persist throughout the Peninsular War. Behind the armies, financial warfare rages as Nathan Rothschild coordinates British subsidies that flow like golden rivers to any nation willing to take French steel. The London banker's network spans continents, his information travelling faster than official dispatches, while his credit supports coalitions that British diplomacy negotiates. Gold becomes a weapon as potent as cavalry charges or artillery barrages. In Paris, finance ministers wrestle with the challenge of sustaining endless campaigns without the British trade that once enriched France. Revenue now flows mainly from tribute demanded of conquered lands and spoils taken from defeated foes. When expansion halts, crisis comes as surely as winter after autumn, though few realize how tightly imperial stability rests on unbroken military triumph. The Continental system takes shape as Bonaparte's weapon against British commerce, its enforcement requiring control over every European port from Hamburg to Naples. The economic blockade aims to strangle British trade while forcing continental consumers to purchase French manufactures. Though implementation proves as challenging as conception appears brilliant. Smuggling flourishes wherever enforcement weakens, while neutral nations resist restrictions that impoverish their merchants. By 1707, the emperor who began as an artillery officer defending the revolution has created an empire that surpasses Charlemagne's in extent while rivaling Rome's in ambition. Yet the very completeness of his triumph contains seeds of future disaster, as success breeds complacency, while resistance hardens among peoples who discover that submission offers no guarantee of fair treatment. The continental system will create enemies where none existed, while imperial relatives prove that blood relationships cannot ensure political loyalty. November 21st, 1806. From the conquered halls of Frederick's Palace in Berlin, Napoleon issues the decree that will transform mainland commerce into a weapon of war. No British goods shall enter any territory under French control. No ship that has touched English ports can dock in territorial harbours. The island kingdom that calls itself a nation of shopkeepers will be strangled by its own mercantile success, forced to watch its empire wither as markets disappear behind walls of Napoleonic bayonets. The Berlin Decree creates the blockade, a trade embargo spanning from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, designed to prove that land power can strangle sea power through systematic exclusion from mainland markets. English merchants who have grown rich on territorial trade will watch their warehouses overflow with unsold goods while their ships anchor idle in Portsmouth and Liverpool. England's response arrives with characteristic swiftness. The orders, in Council of 1807, declare that any vessel trading with French territories must first stop in British ports, submit to inspection, and pay duties that transform neutral business into tribute to the Royal Navy. The fiscal war escalates beyond anything international diplomacy has previously contemplated, with merchant ships becoming prizes and trade routes transforming into battlefields where gold matters more than gunpowder. Neutral nations discover that neutrality has become impossible. American vessels sailing from Boston to Hamburg find themselves seized by British cruisers, their cargoes confiscated and crews impressed into Royal Navy service. Ships departing Charleston for Bordeaux face capture by French privateers, unless they carry certificates proving they have never touched English soil. The young United States, attempting to trade with both belligerents, suffers violations of sovereignty that will eventually drag America into war. The reality of enforcing a blockade across thousands of miles of territorial coastline proves impossible from the moment it begins. Republican customs officials patrol beaches from Hamburg to Naples, yet every fishing village becomes a potential smuggling port. Every isolated cove a landing point for English goods disguised as Turkish textiles or American tobacco. Smuggling flourishes wherever enforcement weakens, creating underground networks that rival official business in sophistication. English manufacturers learn to ship their products through Hamburg, labeled as German-made, through Salonika, marked as Ottoman exports, through any neutral port willing to provide false documentation. The embargo's success depends on perfect coordination across diverse territories, while its violation requires only individual initiative and local corruption. In Paris, coffee costs 10 times its peacetime price, while sugar disappears from middle-class tables, forcing Republican citizens to sweeten their morning beverages with honey or go without entirely. Napoleon responds by ordering massive cultivation of sugar beets, his chemists developing extraction techniques that transform mainland agriculture. Territorial populations learn to prefer beet sugar to cane, though the transition costs fortunes and forces radical changes in dietary habits. Across the Channel in Manchester, textile warehouses overflow with finished goods that cannot reach their traditional markets. Mill owners watch their looms stand idle, while workers find themselves unemployed in a city built on international trade. The riots that follow demonstrate how fiscal warfare affects civilian populations as severely as military campaigns affect professional soldiers. But English business proves more adaptable than Bonaparte anticipated. Merchant houses that once concentrated on mainland markets pivot toward Latin America, the Ottoman Empire, India, and any region beyond Republican control. The City of London's financiers discover that excluding Britain from territorial trade merely forces them to develop global networks that prove more profitable than mainland business had ever been. The policy requires absolute control over territorial political structures. The Kingdom of Holland, under Brother Louis, should enforce the blockade rigorously, yet Dutch merchants continue trading with Britain through techniques ranging from simple smuggling to elaborate business fiction. In 1810, patience exhausted, the Emperor annexes Holland directly to France, eliminating the fiction of independence that had allowed his brother to moderate policies according to local interests. The Papal States present an even greater challenge as Pope Pius VII refuses to enforce measures that would impoverish his temporal domains while contradicting his spiritual obligations. The Pope's opposition to closing his ports against English ships creates a gap in the blockade that Republican merchants exploit as eagerly as their English competitors. Bonaparte's response shocks Catholic territories as French troops occupy Rome while their emperor orders the Pope's arrest and imprisonment. Pius VII finds himself a prisoner in Savona. Then Fontainebleau, his temporal authority suspended while his spiritual influence inspires opposition throughout Catholic regions. The scandal of imprisoning Christ's vicar on earth alienates populations that had previously accepted republican rule. By 1811, the French Empire comprises 130 departments, stretching from Hamburg's Baltic shores to Rome's Seven Hills, its boundaries determined by the blockade's requirements rather than natural frontiers. Administrative efficiency replaces political autonomy, as Hamburg merchants find themselves governed by the same laws that regulate Neapolitan traders. The reorganization modernizes the continent through systematic application of republican administrative techniques and legal codes. The metric measurement spreads across territories where calculations had varied between neighboring villages. Tolls and tariffs that had impeded trade between adjacent territories disappear as Napoleonic business flows freely within expanded boundaries. Medieval fragmentation yields to republican standardization, as local privileges surrender to uniform regulations designed to facilitate trade while serving French interests. Yet the transformation creates conditions for future integration, while generating resentment among populations that value traditional autonomy over administrative convenience. In German universities, students and professors begin discussing concepts that Napoleon had never intended to encourage. If Germans scattered across 300 separate states can be governed by identical laws and share common institutions, perhaps they constitute a single people deserving political unity. Johann Gottlieb Fichte's addresses to the German nation articulate ideas that transform administrative efficiency into national consciousness. The Brothers Grimm collect folk tales not merely to preserve disappearing traditions, but to demonstrate cultural unity that transcends political boundaries imposed by foreign conquest. What Bonaparte intended as administrative convenience becomes the basis for ethnic awakening that will challenge every dynastic claim to territorial authority. Italian intellectuals develop similar arguments as they recognize that Milanese merchants, Tuscan farmers, and Neapolitan craftsmen share cultural characteristics that distinguish them from their republican rulers. Secret societies like the Carbonari meet by candlelight to discuss political futures that would unite the peninsula under Italian rather than foreign leadership. Portugal's refusal to enforce the embargo against Britain provides Napoleon with the pretext for intervention that will prove his greatest strategic error. Portuguese trade depends entirely on English markets and English protection, making compliance with the blockade equivalent to fiscal suicide. November 1807 witnesses Republican armies crossing Spain to occupy Portuguese ports, their march authorized by treaties that Charles IV signs under Napoleonic pressure. The Spanish royal family's weakness and internal divisions tempt Napoleon into interventions that violate both his strategic interests and his previous policy of governing through existing monarchies. March 1808 transforms mediation into kidnapping, as both Spanish kings find themselves prisoners rather than guests in Republican territory. Napoleon's decision to install his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne creates the illusion of another successful conquest, while concealing realities that will make Spanish rule impossible. Trade innovation flourishes within the embargo, as Republican industrialists, protected from English competition, develop manufacturing techniques that might never have emerged under free trade conditions. The jacquard loom revolutionizes silk production in Lyon, while French chemists create synthetic dyes that provide alternatives to imported products. Yet innovation cannot compensate for the complete loss of maritime business that had enriched France's Atlantic ports. Bordeaux wine merchants watch their businesses collapse as inventory accumulates in warehouses that no longer receive foreign orders. The trading cities that had initially supported Bonaparte gradually turn against policies that sacrifice their prosperity to autocratic ambition. By 1808, The embargo has achieved partial success in reducing English trade, while accelerating mainland industrial development, yet its enforcement costs exceed any benefits it provides. The blockade that was intended to strangle Britain gradually strangles the Republican economy as territories discover that prosperity requires international business rather than territorial autarky. The Spanish intervention transforms fiscal policy into military necessity, as maintaining the blockade requires permanent occupation of territories that refuse voluntary compliance. What began as mercantile strategy becomes autocratic overstretch as French armies find themselves committed to campaigns that serve trade objectives rather than strategic priorities. The embargo's logic demands universal enforcement, yet universal enforcement proves militarily impossible and financially ruinous for all concerned. Madrid, May 2nd, 1808. Crowds gather in the Plaza de Armas as French troops escort the last Spanish royal children toward carriages that will carry them into permanent exile. Someone shouts, "They're taking the Infantes," and the cry spreads through the mob like wildfire. A blacksmith named José Blas Molina attacks a Bonapartist officer with his hammer, the first blow in a war that will consume the peninsula for 6 years and drain the strength of an empire. Mamelukes charge into the crowd. Those same Egyptian cavalry who once served the Bey of Cairo now ride for Bonaparte, their curved sabres glinting in the spring sunlight as they cut down peninsular civilians, armed with nothing more than kitchen knives and cobblestones. The imperial formations that conquered the pyramids now battle shopkeepers and seamstresses in narrow streets where disciplined tactics become useless and individual courage determines survival. French artillery unlimbers in the Puerta del Sol, their cannon loaded with grape shot that tears through packed humanity, while the gunners work with mechanical precision learned on a dozen European battlefields. By evening, hundreds lie dead in Madrid's ancient squares, while Republican firing squads execute anyone found with weapons, blood on their clothes, or powder burns on their hands. From his window overlooking the Calle del Desengaño, Francisco Goya watches soldiers drag bodies toward common graves, while their comrades prepare for tomorrow's work. The court painter who has captured the elegance of Iberian nobility now witnesses horror that will haunt his dreams and transform his art. The executions he observes will inspire masterpieces that define warfare's human cost more powerfully than any general's memoirs. Within weeks, all Spain erupts in spontaneous rebellion that defies every principle of martial science and political calculation. This is not organized opposition coordinated by professional officers, but universal fury that spreads from village to village without central command or strategic planning. Local juntas form in every province, each claiming to govern in the name of Ferdinand VII, while rejecting the foreign king imposed by Napoleonic decree. Priests tell their congregations that Napoleon is the Antichrist mentioned in Revelation, his very name containing the mystical number 666, when calculated according to ancient formulae that prove his diabolic nature. The emperor who signed the Concordat and restored Catholic worship in France becomes the beast of the apocalypse in peninsular pulpits, his every victory interpreted as evidence of supernatural evil that only divine intervention can defeat. At Bailen, on July 19th, 1808, the impossible occurs as Iberian regulars under General Castaños compel an entire Republican corps to surrender, the first capitulation of Bonaparte's armies since the Revolutionary Wars began 15 years earlier. General Pierre Dupont's 17,000 veterans lay down their arms before enemies they had been taught to despise, their defeat sending shockwaves through European courts that had assumed French tactical superiority was permanent and unchallengeable. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility shatters like crystals struck by hammers as news of Bailain spreads across the continent. In Vienna and St. Petersburg, diplomats who had resigned themselves to Bonaparte hegemony begin reconsidering their options, while in London, British gold flows toward any Spanish authority willing to continue the struggle. Joseph Bonaparte enters Madrid for the second time on July 20th, his Spanish subjects having fled the capital rather than witness their new monarch's coronation. Pepe Botella, Joe Bottle, as Iberians mockingly call him, rules empty palaces while his people plot his death from mountain hideouts and forest refuges. Autumn brings the emperor himself to the peninsula, with 200,000 veterans drawn from German garrisons and Italian depots. The flower of the Grande Armée marching through Pyrenean passes to restore imperial prestige, tarnished by peninsular defiance. Cities fall with clockwork regularity as Republican columns advance through regions that had defied Bonaparte's power for months. Yet victories mean nothing when enemies refuse to accept defeat as final. The term guerrilla, little war, is born in these mountains as fighters who cannot match French discipline develop tactics that turn imperial strengths into weaknesses. They never fight pitched battles, never defend fixed positions, never offer targets that conventional combat wisdom can address effectively. Instead, they strike supply convoys, murder isolated sentries, ambush messenger services, and disappear into countryside that shelters them like protective mothers hiding endangered children. A Republican lieutenant steps outside his billet to relieve himself and finds his throat cut by men who vanish like smoke into morning mist. Supply wagons that fall behind the main column are discovered burning, their drivers mutilated in ways that serve no martial purpose except psychological warfare designed to terrorize occupying armies. French reprisals escalate the horror as commanders respond to guerrilla attacks with systematic brutality designed to discourage further insurgency. Villages suspected of sheltering partisans are burned, while their inhabitants face execution or exile to regions where survival becomes questionable. Each atrocity creates new guerrillas as families seek vengeance for murdered relatives, transforming Napoleonic occupation into blood feud that transcends rational political objectives. August 1808. Witnesses British intervention. As Sir Arthur Wellesley lands in Portugal with troops that will eventually drive Bonaparte's armies beyond the Pyrenees, the future Duke of Wellington brings to Iberian warfare a defensive genius that transforms imperial tactical superiority into strategic vulnerability. His careful, methodical approach to campaign planning contrasts sharply with Napoleon's preference for rapid maneuver and decisive battle. Wellington's strategy relies on Portugal's unique geography and British naval supremacy to create conditions where Republican numerical advantage becomes irrelevant. The lines of Torres Vedras, massive fortifications protecting Lisbon, provide impregnable refuge where Anglo-Portuguese units can await Bonaparte's exhaustion, rather than seeking premature victory through offensive operations. The war develops a deadly rhythm that consumes resources without producing decisions. French formations advance, taking cities and winning battles against any organized opposition they encounter. But controlling territory requires dispersing troops across regions where guerrilla bands operate with impunity, their local knowledge enabling them to strike Napoleonic positions that cannot be adequately defended. Imperial soldiers concentrate again, abandoning conquered territories that immediately revert to peninsular control. Marshal André Massena, the child of victory, leads 60,000 veterans into Portugal, expecting to crush Wellington through superior numbers and veteran experience. Instead, he discovers enemies who retreat before his advance, while destroying everything that might sustain an invading army. Behind the lines of Torres Vedras, Allied formations wait, while Bonaparte's armies starve in a countryside deliberately emptied of resources. Goya, court painter turned witness to horror, creates his disasters of war. 82 prints that document the reality behind official bulletins and diplomatic protests. His images show Republican soldiers bayoneting civilians, Iberian guerrillas castrating prisoners, women fighting with kitchen knives, children starving in ruined cities. No heroism glorifies these scenes, only endless, purposeless violence that consumes everything it touches. In one devastating print, a corpse sits propped against a tree, holding a sign that reads, "Nada," nothing. This is what it says. Goya captions the image, his commentary serving as epitaph for enlightenment, hopes that reasonable men might end warfare through rational negotiation. Juan Martín Díaz, el empecinado, the stubborn one, commands 3,000 irregulars who tie down 20,000 Bonaparte soldiers through hit-and-run tactics that make conventional response impossible. The former farmer turned guerrilla leader understands terrain and population in ways that no tricolour staff officer can master, his knowledge enabling him to appear where enemies least expect, while vanishing before retaliation becomes effective. By 1811, 300,000 French troops occupy the peninsula, more soldiers than the emperor deployed at Austerlitz and Jena combined. Yet they control little beyond the ground they actually stand on. Every march becomes a campaign. Every messenger service requires escort. Every supply convoy needs protection that weakens the units it intends to sustain. Spain becomes what Bonaparte himself calls his Spanish ulcer, a wound that drains imperial strength while never healing or yielding to treatment. Marshal Nicholas Soult, victor of Austerlitz, finds himself repeatedly outmaneuvered by Wellington, despite commanding formations that should overwhelm Anglo-Portuguese defiance. Marshal Claude Victor barely escapes encirclement when Peninsular regulars and British formations coordinate attacks that threaten to destroy entire corps through systematic cooperation. The constitutional experiment at Cadiz offers hope that Spanish opposition might transcend mere reaction against foreign occupation to embrace liberal principles that could modernize the kingdom after Republican withdrawal. The Cortes of 1812 creates Europe's most advanced constitution, its provisions guaranteeing press freedom, religious tolerance, and popular sovereignty that surpass even revolutionary French precedents. Yet most Spaniards fighting the occupiers oppose these liberal reforms as vigorously as they contest imperial domination, their loyalty directed toward traditional monarchy and Catholic orthodoxy rather than constitutional innovation. When Ferdinand VII returns in 1814, he abolishes the liberal constitution, restores the Inquisition, and executes the very men who had maintained Iberian insurgency during his captivity. The peninsula's transformation into what Marshal Ney calls a war without battles continues year after year, consuming Republican resources while producing no strategic advantage commensurate with the investment required. The region becomes proof that modern armies, however superior in conventional warfare, cannot defeat populations united in revolt unless they are prepared to commit genocide, an expedient that even tricolour ruthlessness finds unacceptable. The Spanish Ulcer bleeds the Grande Armée's strength while teaching lessons about irregular warfare that will influence combat thinking long after the last French soldier crosses the Pyrenees. National rebellion proves more formidable than dynastic armies when it combines popular support with foreign assistance, geographic advantages with tactical innovation, and strategic patience with operational flexibility that conventional doctrine cannot address through established methods. With his marriage to Marie-Louise, daughter of Austria's Emperor Francis, Napoleon joins his empire to the Habsburgs, rulers of Central Europe for 600 years, while invoking the lineage of Caesar and Charlemagne. The princess, who once belonged to a future erased by revolution, now reigns as Empress of the French. Her pedigree, a validation no conquest could provide. Josephine weeps at Malmaison, her tears genuine for perhaps the first time since her husband's return from Egypt. The Creole beauty, who enchanted the young general with her sophistication and sexual knowledge, finds herself discarded like a worn uniform, her failure to produce an heir making her expendable in imperial calculations that value dynasties over affection. The divorce that Napoleon orchestrates through compliant senators breaks his own heart even as it serves his political necessities. The marriage ceremony at the Louvre combines revolutionary grandeur with monarchical tradition as Marie-Louise walks down aisles where Austrian prisoners once awaited execution during the Terror. The Habsburg princess, who had been taught to fear the Corsican ogre, discovers instead a man whose intellectual brilliance and personal charm overcome years of propaganda designed to demonize French power. Their union represents more than diplomatic convenience. It symbolizes the transformation of revolutionary energy into dynastic respectability. March 1811 brings the birth that justifies every sacrifice Bonaparte has made for dynastic continuity. Marie-Louise bears a son who receives the title King of Rome. Before drawing his first breath, the infant proclaimed heir to an empire that stretches from Hamburg to Naples. The cannon that announced his birth fire 101 salvos, the number reserved for male heirs, while courtiers who had witnessed the Terror now kneel before a baby whose blood carries both revolutionary and imperial legitimacy. Russia, France's ally since Tilsit, suffers under the Continental system's restrictions, with growing resentment that threatens the partnership on which European stability depends. Russian nobles who had grown wealthy, selling grain and timber to British merchants, watch their fortunes evaporate as ports close and traditional trade routes become illegal. The ruble's collapse forces aristocrats to mortgage estates that have sustained their families for generations, their economic distress creating political pressure that even autocratic authority cannot ignore indefinitely. Tsar Alexander finds himself torn between allegiance to his alliance with France and duty to subjects sinking under hardship. The Continental system, which Bonaparte deems vital against Britain, edges the Russian nobility toward ruin, endangering the very class that upholds Romanov rule. Confidential memoranda from his finance ministers warn that continued obedience to French demands will collapse the empire's economic base, leaving the monarch to decide between external loyalty and internal survival. Marie Walewska, Napoleon's Polish mistress, bears him a son in 1810, though this proof of imperial virility comes too late to prevent the Austrian marriage that state necessity demands. The beautiful countess believes passionately in Bonaparte's promise to restore Polish independence, her devotion representing millions of Poles who see French power as their only hope for national resurrection. Her faith will prove tragically misplaced, as imperial ambition exceeds even Polish patriotism's capacity for sacrifice. In Paris salons, marshals who conquered Europe express private doubts about their master's latest strategic obsession. Veterans who have marched from Spain to Austria question the wisdom of campaigns in regions where supply lines stretch across impossible distances, while enemies retreat into spaces too vast for any army to occupy effectively. Berthier, the indispensable chief of staff, confides to intimates his desire to retire to his estates, rather than organize another impossible expedition. Some marshals grow soft in luxury that peace has made possible, their military edge dulled by Parisian society that values wealth over warfare. Murat, king of Naples, thinks more of preserving his Mediterranean kingdom than supporting new adventures that could cost him everything he has gained. Bernadotte, Crown Prince of Sweden, secretly negotiates with enemies while maintaining the fiction of loyalty to his former commander. The band of brothers who conquered Europe fragments as success breeds different ambitions. Throughout 1811, military preparations reveal the scope of imperial ambition as the Grande Armée of 1812 assembles from every corner of the empire. Over 600,000 men gather in Polish depots, the largest army ever assembled in European history, representing 20 nationalities united only by the Republican leadership and the promise of Eastern conquest. Supply depots established across Poland accumulate provisions for campaigns that dwarf any previous expeditions in scale and complexity. Maps prepared by imperial cartographers show every road, river, and village from Warsaw to Moscow, their accuracy reflecting intelligence networks that span the continent. Hospital supplies for 100,000 casualties demonstrate realistic planning for warfare's inevitable costs, though even these preparations prove inadequate for the disasters that await. Nothing is left to chance except chance itself, which will prove more decisive than any human calculation. The Tsar prepares for conflict with equal thoroughness, importing British advisors and British gold through neutral Sweden, while his armies adopt scorched earth strategies designed to deny French forces the resources they need for sustained campaigns. Russian generals debate whether to fight at the frontier or retreat into their vast interior, their disagreements reflecting uncertainty about how to combat enemies whose tactical superiority is matched by logistical vulnerability in regions where roads disappear and cities become islands in hostile emptiness. Orthodox priests receive instructions to preach holy war against the Antichrist Napoleon, their sermons transforming political conflict into religious crusade that mobilizes populations who might otherwise remain indifferent to dynastic disputes. The emperor who restored Catholicism in France becomes Satan incarnate in Russian churches, his previous accommodation with religion forgotten in propaganda, designed to inspire resistance that transcends rational military calculation. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw's existence terrifies every government that participated in Poland's destruction, its resurrection under Napoleonic protection, suggesting that Bonaparte's ambitions extend beyond mere territorial conquest to include ethnic reorganization of European boundaries. Russian fears about Polish restoration prove well-founded as Napoleon considers expanding the duchy to include territories that 3 partitions had distributed among Prussia, Austria, and the autocracy itself. Alexander demands retreat beyond the Rhine, the end of the Grand Duchy, and freedom for Russian commerce. Napoleon counters with conditions: Russian ports barred to neutrals, reductions in military strength, and recognition of French sway across Germany. Each emperor defends non-negotiable claims, ensuring months of diplomacy achieve nothing. Early 1812 brings final attempts at peaceful settlement, as both rulers recognize that war will cost more than any conceivable benefit it might provide. Napoleon's demands for commercial compliance conflict with Russian economic necessities, while Alexander's insistence on trade freedom threatens the continental system's effectiveness against British power. The diplomatic deadlock reflects incompatible strategic requirements that no negotiation can reconcile without one side accepting defeat without fighting. April 1812 witnesses the emperor's departure from Paris for Dresden, where tributary kings assemble to pay homage before the greatest military expedition in European history begins its eastward march. The King of Prussia provides troops he desperately wishes to withhold, while the Emperor of Austria contributes forces to fight his own daughter's husband. Only Bernadotte refuses participation, keeping Swedish neutrality while secretly planning betrayal of his former chief. May brings the Grande Armée's concentration in Poland as veterans who fought at Austerlitz March, alongside conscripts who have never seen battle, their diversity reflecting the empire's multinational character while creating communication problems that will plague the campaign. Supply wagons stretch for miles across Polish countryside that cannot sustain such numbers, their contents representing France's accumulated wealth transformed into military potential that must achieve decisive victory or face catastrophic loss. The army consumes in one day what entire provinces produce in a month, its appetite for supplies revealing the logistical impossibility of sustaining such forces in regions where local resources cannot meet military requirements. Veterans who have lived off conquered territories since Italy discover that Poland's poverty makes their usual methods inadequate, forcing reliance on supply lines that stretch across hundreds of miles of increasingly hostile territory. Napoleon issues proclamations declaring that Alexander has broken the Tilsit agreements, threatens European peace, and must accept submission to French leadership. The emperor who once promised that Austerlitz would be his last battle now prepares for conflict that he privately acknowledges represents his final gamble for European supremacy. At 42, he recognizes that age and enemies are accumulating faster than victories can eliminate them. June 23rd, 1812. The Grande Armée begins crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory under cover of darkness. Hundreds of thousands of men walking across bridges toward destinies none can foresee. No declaration of war accompanies the invasion, just the largest military force in human history advancing into spaces too vast for any army to control effectively. The emperor watches from a hilltop as his columns disappear into forests that have never known foreign conquest. Bonaparte's horse stumbles while he observes the crossing, throwing him to the ground in full view of his staff. Superstitious soldiers whisper that omens foretell disaster, though Napoleon dismisses such concerns with characteristic rationalism. The fall seems insignificant compared to the army's magnitude and his own confidence, yet those who witness it remember the moment as prophetic, when later events reveal how completely fortune has abandoned the man who once claimed to be its master. The invasion begins with expectations of rapid victory through decisive battles that will force Alexander to negotiate before winter makes campaigning impossible. French generals plan for campaigns lasting 50 days at most, their calculations based on previous experiences where enemy armies offered battle rather than retreating into emptiness. The strategy that conquered Europe will prove inadequate for conquering spaces where armies can disappear without surrendering, and victories become meaningless unless they produce political settlements. Behind the advancing columns, supply lines stretch across Polish territories that have been stripped bare to sustain the expedition's impossible appetite. Civilians who welcomed French liberation from Prussian or Austrian rule discover that military necessity recognizes no distinction between allies and enemies when food becomes scarce, and survival requires ruthless requisition of whatever resources can be found. The emperor, who began as an artillery officer defending the revolution, has created the ultimate expression of revolutionary warfare, a citizen army that represents every European nationality united under French leadership for conquest, that will either establish permanent hegemony or destroy the empire that 20 years of victory have created. The stakes could not be higher, as the Grande Armée disappears into Russian forests, where trees have witnessed the rise and fall of countless armies that believed themselves invincible. As summer begins, Napoleon commands more men than any European ruler since Xerxes invaded Greece, his confidence justified by victories that span 2 decades and encompass every battlefield from Spain to Poland. Yet the empire's survival depends entirely on the success of campaigns in territories where geography favors defenders and climate destroys invaders who cannot achieve swift victory. The ultimate test of Napoleonic genius is about to begin, in landscapes where genius may prove insufficient against the elements themselves. The Grande Armée crosses the Niemen, expecting immediate battle, but discovers instead a wilderness that swallows armies without offering resistance. Russian forces retreat eastward, burning crops, poisoning wells, driving away livestock that might sustain invading troops. Napoleon's supply wagons, calculated for a 50-day campaign, cannot feed 600,000 men, marching through a landscape deliberately emptied of resources. Lithuanian roads marked clearly on Republican maps prove to be dirt tracks that disappear in summer rain, their surfaces turning to mud that swallows artillery pieces and lames cavalry horses. The army that crossed into the autocracy begins shrinking immediately, as stragglers fall behind columns that move too fast for the sick and exhausted to maintain pace. By July, desertion and disease have cost Bonaparte 100,000 men without a single major engagement. Russian armies under Prince Mikhail Barclay de Tolly execute strategic withdrawal with methodical precision that frustrates every attempt to force decisive combat. The autocracy's forces avoid battles they cannot win, while extending supply lines that enemies cannot sustain indefinitely. Villages evacuated before Republican arrival offer nothing but empty houses and poisoned wells. Their former inhabitants vanished into forests that provide no maps can penetrate. By July, the problems multiply faster than solutions as horses die from eating unripe grain. Men succumb to dysentery from drinking contaminated water, and artillery pieces abandoned on roadsides mark the army's passage like tombstones. Lithuanian peasants who should welcome liberation from Russian rule instead flee from liberators whose massive appetite devours everything in their path. The expedition that should inspire gratitude generates only terror among populations it claims to protect. The mid-August battle at Smolensk marks the campaign's first major encounter. Barclay's army entrenched behind walls that have stood for centuries along the Dnieper. Attacking columns smash the fortifications with concentrated fire, but the defenders retreat over the river after setting the town ablaze. Napoleon arrives to claim only ruins and empty granaries. The burning of Smolensk reveals Russian strategy with crystalline clarity: yield territory while destroying everything that might sustain foreign occupation. General Mikhail Kutuzov, the one-eyed veteran appointed to replace Barclay after noble complaints about endless retreat, understands that the autocracy's strength lies in its vastness rather than its armies. Patience and time, he tells subordinates who demand aggressive action. Those are the motherland's warriors. September 7th, 1812. 70 miles from Moscow, Kutuzov finally accepts battle at Borodino, deploying 120,000 citizens across ridges that command the road to the ancient capital. The encounter both armies understand will determine Moscow's fate, brings together 250,000 men and 1,200 cannon in combat that will produce the bloodiest single day in European military history before the 20th century's industrial slaughter. The battle starts at 6 a.m. with Republican artillery preparing positions that Russian engineers have fortified through weeks of systematic labor. Attack follows counterattack, as earthworks change hands repeatedly, their parapets slippery with blood, while cannon fire tears gaps in formations that close ranks and advance again. The great redoubt becomes a charnel house where men fight hand to hand among corpses that pile like cordwood. Bonaparte, usually brilliant in tactical command, applies simple frontal pressure against positions that should be turned rather than assaulted directly. His imperial guard stands unused throughout the engagement. 20,000 elite veterans who could shatter Kutuzov's center but remain inactive while their master refuses to commit his final reserve 1,500 miles from Paris. "I will not have my guard destroyed so far from France," he declares, choosing caution over decisive action. By evening, 75,000 casualties litter the field, while neither side can claim meaningful victory. Russians withdraw in good order toward Moscow, their army bloodied but intact, while Republican forces count losses that represent 1/3 of their effective strength. Kutuzov's retreat appears to concede defeat, yet strategic reality suggests otherwise. The autocracy can replace losses, while Bonaparte cannot. September 14th witnesses the emperor's entry into Moscow, expecting to find delegations offering surrender keys, but discovering instead a city abandoned by its inhabitants. 250,000 residents have fled rather than submit to foreign occupation, leaving behind empty palaces and deserted streets that echo with the footsteps of conquerors who have won everything except what they need most: political settlement that acknowledges their victory. That night, fires begin in the Bazaar Quarter, their flames spreading through wooden structures that burn like tinder in autumn wind. For 4 days, Moscow burns while Republican soldiers loot abandoned mansions, their arms filled with silk and silver, while the city that should shelter them becomes an inferno. Governor Fyodor Rostopchin's incendiaries have transformed the ancient capital into a funeral pyre that consumes Russian wealth rather than surrendering it to foreign enemies. Bonaparte installs himself in the Kremlin, occupying rooms once used by Ivan the Terrible to scheme his dominions. Yet his proclamations cannot mask that triumph on the battlefield has yielded only defeat in politics. The conqueror of Moscow discovers himself abandoned in a flaming capital, its desolation ridiculing every plan that foresaw surrender once the sacred heart of the nation was lost. Weeks pass without peace overtures, as Alexander maintains silence that becomes more eloquent than any diplomatic protest. Napoleon sends envoys to St. Petersburg, with terms that grow more generous as autumn advances toward winter. But the autocrat refuses all communication with invaders, whose presence on Russian soil represents intolerable insult to orthodox dignity and imperial authority. October 19th brings the decision that transforms triumph into catastrophe, as Bonaparte orders evacuation of the empty prize his army has paid so dearly to capture. The Grande Armée leaves Moscow carrying loot that will prove worthless when survival requires abandoning everything except weapons and food. 100,000 men march westward, still confident that retreat means temporary withdrawal rather than permanent disaster. Kutuzov blocks the southern route to Kaluga, forcing Republican columns onto the northern road they used during their advance, territory already stripped bare and lined with unburied corpses from the march toward Moscow. The same path that brought them to victory now becomes the avenue of their destruction, its milestones marked by graves that multiply with each passing day. November 4th marks the arrival of General Winter, Russia's most reliable ally in its struggle against foreign invasion. Snow begins falling as temperatures drop to 20 degrees below freezing, conditions that transform European warfare into Arctic survival. Soldiers wearing summer uniforms stuff paper and straw into their clothing, while muskets become too cold to fire without burning bare skin. The army disintegrates as unit cohesion collapses under pressures that discipline cannot withstand indefinitely. Men die with buboes swelling their necks as typhus spreads through ranks already weakened by starvation and exposure. Horses collapse with foam on their lips, their meat devoured raw by soldiers who have forgotten the taste of bread. The retreat becomes a death march across landscapes that seem cursed by divine wrath. Cossack raiders circle the dying columns like wolves sensing wounded prey, their hit-and-run attacks claiming stragglers who lack strength to keep pace with formations that grow smaller each day. Peasants armed with pitchforks hunt isolated groups, their fury reflecting years of foreign occupation that have taught them to hate invaders more than they fear military retaliation. Every night, thousands lie down in snow and never rise. November the 26th to 29th brings the ultimate test at the Berezina River, where the waterway that should be frozen solid in late November has thawed just enough to prevent crossing while remaining too icy for boats. 50,000 effective soldiers and 40,000 stragglers face rushing water, with Russian armies converging from 3 directions, their trap seemingly perfect. Bonaparte's engineers work in freezing current to build 2 bridges from materials salvaged from abandoned villages, their heroism enabling the guard to cross first, while combat units follow in formations that maintain some semblance of military order. Stragglers panic when they see escape routes, rushing bridges that collapse under weight they cannot support. Hundreds drown in water that runs red beneath the ice. As masses struggle to cross bridges far too narrow, enemy guns find their range, shells ripping through soldiers and non-combatants together. Engineers set fire to the crossings, even as thousands remain trapped. Those abandoned are condemned to die or be taken, while the retreat moves west, its trail littered with ruins and corpses stiff with frost. December 5th at Smorgon brings Bonaparte's ultimate betrayal as he abandons his dying army to return to Paris, where news of General Malet's attempted coup during his absence threatens political survival that military disaster has already compromised. Traveling by sleigh and carriage, the Emperor crosses Europe in 13 days, while behind him, the Grande Armée's remnants stumble through snowdrifts toward frontiers they may never reach. Marshal Michel Ney commands the rear guard with courage that transcends human endurance, his face blackened with powder as he personally fires muskets against Cossacks who press closer each day. The bravest of the brave appears last seen at Kovno, still fighting while his uniform falls apart and his men die around him. Of 600,000 who cross the Niemen, fewer than 100,000 return, and of those survivors, fewer than 10,000 retain capacity for further combat. The catastrophe's scale numbs comprehension as numbers become meaningless abstractions that cannot capture individual tragedies multiplied across entire populations. 400,000 dead, 100,000 prisoners, 200,000 horses, 1,000 cannon. The accumulated military resources of a decade vanish in 6 months of campaigning that destroys the myth of Napoleonic invincibility, along with the armies that sustained it. More devastating than statistics, the expedition's veterans are gone forever. Men who fought at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram now lie frozen in Russian snow, their experience and loyalty irreplaceable assets that no conscription can restore. The institutional memory that enabled Republican forces to dominate European battlefields dies with sergeants who will never train new recruits or corporals who will never lead fresh companies into combat. Europe watches and calculates as reports filter westward, describing destruction so complete that even enemies feel shocked by its magnitude. If the Grande Armée can be eliminated this catastrophically, perhaps Bonaparte himself can be defeated permanently. The wolves begin gathering as winter loosens its grip, and diplomatic pouches carry promises of British gold to any sovereign willing to take Republican steel. In Paris, the sovereign who once dictated the fate of the continent returns broken, his announcements powerless against the truth that snowstorms have achieved what Austria and Prussia could never claim. The withdrawal from Moscow is remembered not only as catastrophe in arms, but as the first fracture in an empire built on the legend of a commander immune to nature's limits. The invasion that was intended to force Russian submission instead demonstrates the limits of military power when confronted by strategic patience, geographic immensity, and populations willing to sacrifice everything rather than submit to foreign domination. The autocracy's victory proves that some conquests cost more than any possible benefit they might provide, while some enemies grow stronger through apparent defeat than they ever were in nominal triumph. Napoleon races toward Paris in a closed carriage, his journey a desperate attempt to outrun news of the catastrophe that has destroyed the myth of his invincibility. Behind him, the Grande Armée's frozen remnants stumble westward through Polish snow, while ahead, the political crisis that General Malet's coup attempt has revealed threatens to topple an empire built on military success. The Emperor arrives at the Tuileries before reports of the disaster's full magnitude reach European capitals, but silence cannot long conceal losses that will reshape continental politics. But across Europe, the calculation changes as intelligence reports filter through diplomatic channels describing destruction so complete that even Bonaparte's enemies struggle to comprehend its magnitude. In Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Emperor Francis studies maps showing Russian armies advancing westward, while his advisors whisper that perhaps the Corsican upstart can be defeated permanently. From London, British gold begins flowing toward any sovereign willing to challenge the weakened colossus whose military reputation lies buried in Russian snow. Prussia, forced ally of France since Jena's humiliation, signs the Convention of Tauroggen in secret alliance with the autocracy. General Ludwig Yorck's decision to abandon Bonaparte represents more than military defection. It signals that German nationalism, awakened by years of foreign occupation, now burns brighter than dynastic loyalty. The kingdom that Frederick the Great made formidable prepares to reclaim its honor through arms rather than diplomacy. Spring 1813 witnesses Napoleon performing perhaps his greatest feat as he creates a new army from the ashes of Russian disaster. 200,000 men, many of them teenagers barely old enough to carry muskets, assemble under commanders who remember Austerlitz and Wagram. The emperor's energy, undimmed by defeat, transforms French potential into military reality through administrative genius that rivals his battlefield brilliance. At Lutzen, on May 2nd, Republican forces defeat the combined armies of Prussia and Russia in combat that demonstrates Bonaparte's tactical abilities remain unimpaired by strategic catastrophe. The young conscripts who should flee before veteran enemies instead hold their formations, while imperial artillery tears gaps in coalition ranks. Bautzen follows on May 20th to 21st, as another triumph validates the emperor's faith in his ability to overcome numerical disadvantage through superior positioning. Yet these are not the annihilating victories that characterized earlier campaigns. Enemies retreat in good order, rather than dissolving into panic, their losses significant but not catastrophic. The new conscripts die bravely, but cannot execute the complex maneuvers that veteran formations once performed instinctively. The fatal error comes in June, when Austria proposes an armistice that Bonaparte accepts in hopes of dividing his enemies through negotiation rather than continuing military pressure. His representatives meet at Prague, while both sides reinforce their armies. The suspension of hostilities, providing time that serves coalition interests far more than imperial necessities. Every week of peace brings fresh Russian divisions westward, while Prussian mobilization calls the Landwehr to arms. Austrian preparations proceed with methodical efficiency, as Prince Metternich's diplomacy weaves the alliance that British subsidies fund and shared fear cements into unbreakable unity. When negotiations predictably fail in August, Bonaparte faces 800,000 coalition troops, with 400,000 Republican soldiers, whose quality cannot compensate for numerical disadvantage. August 26th to 27th brings Dresden, where Napoleon wins his final great victory against odds that would have daunted any commander who lacked his supreme confidence. Coalition attacks on the fortified city meet Republican counter-assaults delivered with clockwork precision, the enemy losses exceeding 38,000, while Bonaparte's casualties total fewer than 10,000. For one last moment, imperial magic seems to transcend material reality. Yet simultaneous defeats of his lieutenants elsewhere transform tactical triumph into strategic disaster. Marshal Nicholas Oudinot suffers defeat at Grossbeeren while attempting to capture Berlin. At the Katzbach River, Marshal Etienne Macdonald's forces crumble before Prussian attacks led by General Gebhard von Blücher. The coalition's strategy becomes clear: avoid the emperor while attacking his subordinates, whose limitations become fatal weaknesses when they fight independently. October 16th to 19th, 1813, witnesses the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, where 365,000 coalition soldiers face 200,000 Republican troops, in the largest engagement European history will record, until the industrial slaughter of the 20th century. The emperor chooses to fight rather than retreat, hoping that one decisive victory might shatter alliance unity. The clash unfolds over 4 days of systematic destruction that reduces military science to simple arithmetic. More men, more guns, more supplies defeating equal courage through mathematical certainty. On the first day, Republican positions hold against assaults that test every innovation Bonaparte has developed. The second day brings reinforcements to both armies, as the struggle intensifies without decisive advantage. The third day proves catastrophic when Saxon and Württemberg contingents, German troops fighting reluctantly for Bonaparte against their own kinsmen, desert in the middle of battle, turning their weapons against Republican forces they had been ordered to support. The betrayal opens gaps in imperial lines that coalition cavalry exploits with devastating effect. Prince Poniatowski, Marshal of France and descendant of Polish kings, drowns attempting to swim the Ulster River when the single bridge connecting Leipzig to the west explodes prematurely, trapping 30,000 Republican soldiers who might otherwise have escaped encirclement. The Polish prince's death symbolizes the multinational empire's dissolution as satellite kingdoms abandon their French patron. The retreat becomes rout as surviving imperial forces struggle across a bridge too narrow for the masses attempting to flee coalition pursuit. Republican losses total 70,000 casualties in 4 days of fighting that eliminates Bonaparte's remaining field army. November 1813 brings the final collapse of the Confederation of the Rhine, as German princes scramble to join the winning side, before punishment overtakes those who maintain loyalty to fallen imperial power. Bavaria switches allegiances before Leipzig's outcome becomes certain, while Württemberg and Baden follow within days. More personally devastating, Joachim Murat abandons his brother-in-law to save his Neapolitan throne through separate negotiations with Austrian representatives. In Holland, revolution greets news of Leipzig's defeat as the Prince of Orange returns from British exile to reclaim ancestral authority. Belgian provinces follow their northern neighbours into rebellion, while Republican garrisons, needed elsewhere, cannot suppress revolts that spread faster than reinforcements can arrive. Eugene de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepson and Viceroy of Italy, fights brilliantly but hopelessly as Austrian armies pour through Alpine passes. The Kingdom of Italy collapses despite Eugene's tactical skill and personal loyalty, its artificial boundaries proving incapable of generating popular support when foreign armies offer liberation. Wellington crosses the Pyrenees in autumn triumph as the Peninsular War reaches its inevitable conclusion. Joseph Bonaparte flees Spain permanently, while Republican armies that have fought courageously for 6 years retreat toward France itself. The Duke's veterans, hardened by years of peninsular fighting, march toward Toulouse, carrying experience that will prove invaluable in campaigns to come. End of 1813 finds France facing invasion from every direction, as coalition armies mass on frontiers that had seemed secure when Russian snow first began falling on the Grande Armée's retreat. Germanic forces gather along the Rhine, while Austrian columns prepare to advance through Switzerland, their movements coordinated by staff work that reflects lessons learned from 20 years of defeat at Republican hands. The Royal Navy maintains absolute blockade of every Republican port from Hamburg to Genoa, their ships intercepting supply vessels that might sustain the defense while landing British gold wherever coalition forces can establish secure communications. Maritime supremacy, established at Trafalgar and maintained through systematic attrition, proves as decisive as any battlefield victory. Fortress France prepares for siege warfare on an unprecedented scale, as Bonaparte summons every available resource to defend frontiers that stretch from the Channel to the Mediterranean. The prefects, who had administered conquered territories, now organize resistance in departments that have never known foreign occupation. The Allies debate terms that range from generous peace with natural frontiers to complete dismantlement of Republican power, their negotiations complicated by conflicting national interests that victory has not eliminated. Tsar Alexander seeks to march triumphantly through Paris in revenge for Moscow's burning, while Metternich prefers balance that weakens France without creating Prussian or Russian hegemony. In Paris, conscription orders summon boys and old men to defend an empire built by veterans who lie frozen in Russian snow or buried in German soil. The nation that had raised 750,000 soldiers for the levée en masse now struggles to field 200,000 effective troops, its human resources exhausted by 20 years of continuous warfare. The emperor who had seemed invincible now faces the ultimate test of his political and military genius. The winter of 1813 to 1814 will provide answers that determine not only Bonaparte's fate, but the future of European civilization itself. Allied armies surge across the Rhine like an avalanche from the Alps, 300,000 men advancing with the precision born of 20 years of hard lessons in defeat. Against them, Napoleon musters barely 70,000, youth scarcely old enough to shave alongside veterans scarred by every field from Italy to Germany. These Marie-Louises, as the conscripts are derisively named, are charged with defending an empire under odds that might have daunted Alexander or Caesar. What follows becomes perhaps the Corsican's most brilliant campaign, as he transforms desperate defense into tactical masterpiece that rivals any achievement of his golden years. Like a chess master facing multiple opponents, the emperor strikes where enemies least expect. His movements so rapid that Allied commanders lose track of Republican forces that appear and vanish like phantoms haunting the countryside they know better than any foreigner can learn. At Champaubert on February 10th, Bonaparte destroys an isolated Russian division through concentration that achieves local superiority despite overall numerical disadvantage. The young conscripts who should flee before veteran Cossacks instead hold their formations, while French artillery tears gaps in enemy ranks that remember Moscow, but have forgotten the tactical innovations that made Republican forces supreme on European battlefields. Montmirail follows on February 11th as another crushing victory demonstrates that genius can transcend material limitations when properly applied. Château-Thierry on February 12th and Vauchamp on February 14th complete 4 triumphs in 5 days that shock Allied leadership into reconsidering their assumptions about the commander's capacity for resistance. The mathematics of warfare seem suspended when one man's brilliance compensates for every disadvantage that logic suggests should prove decisive. But victories mean nothing without strategic consequences that transform tactical success into political settlement. The emperor defeats enemies in detail, yet they regenerate with endless reinforcements drawn from populations that dwarf French resources. Every Republican casualty represents irreplaceable loss, while enemy armies replace their dead from reserves that seem inexhaustible. The brutal arithmetic becomes clear as winter gives way to spring campaigning season. For every Allied soldier killed, 3 arrive to take his place. For every Republican veteran who falls, France must send a boy who has never fired his musket in anger. The commander who once led Europe's finest armies now directs children against professional soldiers whose experience spans decades of continental warfare. March 1814 witnesses the noose tightening as enemy columns converge on the capital, while Napoleon fights brilliant holding actions that cannot prevent inevitable defeat. His genius remains undiminished, his tactical innovations as deadly as ever, yet individual brilliance cannot overcome collective mediocrity when the collective possesses overwhelming numerical advantage combined with professional competence. At La Fère-Champenoise, Marshals Auguste de Marmont and Édouard Mortier suffer defeat while attempting to defend the approaches to Paris, their forces overwhelmed by Austrian and Russian columns that coordinate attacks with precision their predecessors had never achieved. The 2 commanders who have served Bonaparte since his earliest campaigns watch their formations disintegrate under pressure that experience cannot withstand when outnumbered 4-1. March 30th brings enemy armies to the capital's outskirts, while the emperor races back from defeating another Prussian force 40 miles distant. His carriage travels through countryside already occupied by opponents whose campfires dot the landscape like fallen stars, their presence demonstrating how completely the strategic situation has deteriorated despite tactical successes that maintain the illusion of possible victory. Joseph Bonaparte, nominally defending the capital as his brother's lieutenant, flees eastward with the government as Cossack patrols appear in suburbs that have never known foreign occupation. The King of Spain, who proved incompetent in Madrid, demonstrates equal inadequacy in the city of his birth, his departure symbolizing the dynastic system's collapse when military pressure exceeds political capacity for resistance. March 31st witnesses Tsar Alexander and King Frederick William of Prussia entering the capital that had humiliated both their nations during years of French dominance. Parisians who had cheered Bonapartist victories now line boulevards to welcome liberators whose gold purchases bread that Republican conscription had made scarce. White Bourbon cockades appear on lapels that had displayed tricolour ribbons since the Revolution began. Marmont's surrender of Paris represents more than military capitulation. It marks the betrayal of personal loyalty that had sustained autocratic power through disasters that would have destroyed conventional monarchies. The Marshal, who had fought beside the Corsican since the Italian campaign, signs armistice terms that abandon the capital, rather than subjecting it to bombardment that might preserve dynastic honor. while destroying civilian lives. The Senate, that rubber stamp assembly created to legitimize absolute rule, votes to depose the emperor whose authority had seemed unquestionable when victories flowed like water from mountain springs. Senators who had grown rich from Republican patronage now scramble to accommodate themselves with conquering powers whose clemency depends on demonstrating sufficient enthusiasm for regime change. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand emerges from political shadows to host the Tsar in his elegant mansion, the former bishop's survival instincts having detected changing winds. Before others realize that storms approach, his drawing room becomes headquarters for restoration planning, as aristocrats who had fled revolutionary terror return to reclaim positions that exile had temporarily interrupted. Bonaparte reaches Fontainebleau Palace with 60,000 soldiers still willing to die for his cause, their loyalty unshaken by defeats that have cost them everything, except devotion to the man who led them across Europe in pursuit of glory that now seems as ephemeral as morning mist. The general studies maps that show enemy forces surrounding the capital, while he plans attacks that might yet restore the impossible. His marshals refuse to march on Paris in campaigns that would require fighting through civilians to reach opponents who hold overwhelming advantages in numbers, supplies, and strategic position. Michel Ney, bravest of the brave, speaks for all when he declares with voice that carries absolute finality, the army will not march. Without his commanders, Napoleon cannot wage war, regardless of his personal courage or strategic genius. April 4th brings the offer to abdicate in favor of his infant son, with Marie-Louise serving as regent until the King of Rome reaches majority. The proposal seems reasonable to men who understand that dynasties transcend individuals, yet Allied representatives reject any arrangement that might preserve Bonapartist succession through another generation. The choice becomes unconditional surrender or pointless resistance that serves only personal pride. April 6th witnesses the signature that ends an epoch as the emperor abdicates without conditions, his pen scratching across parchment that transforms European politics with finality that no battlefield victory could achieve. The man who ruled from Madrid to Moscow signs away an empire in exchange for sovereignty over Elba, a Mediterranean island whose 12,000 inhabitants represent his entire remaining domain. Night of April 12th to 13th brings the ultimate desperation as Bonaparte attempts suicide with poison he has carried since the Russian campaign, the vial containing chemicals intended for situations exactly like the one that now confronts him. Yet the mixture, 2 years old and weakened by time, produces only hours of agony without the merciful death that would spare him the humiliation of survival as a fallen dictator. I am condemned to live, he tells his aide-de-camp Armand de Caulaincourt, as dawn reveals that even death refuses to accommodate his wishes. The man who controlled the destiny of millions cannot command his own mortality when circumstances make existence unbearable, yet continuation inevitable. April the 20th arrives with ceremonies that break the hearts of soldiers who have followed their chief across every battlefield that European warfare has produced. In Fontainebleau's courtyard, Napoleon bids farewell to the old guard, whose devotion had sustained French power through 20 years of triumph and disaster. These veterans weep openly as their commander embraces General Antoine Dreux and kisses the eagle's standard that had led them to victory in battles whose names will echo through history. Soldiers of my old guard, the fallen emperor declares in voice that carries across the courtyard to men who remember Italy and Egypt, Austerlitz and Wagram. I bid you farewell. For 20 years, I have constantly accompanied you on the road to honor and glory. Continue to serve France. Do not grieve for my fate. I shall be happy when I know that you are content and glorious. The journey south becomes increasingly dangerous as Bonapartist sympathy gives way to royalist fury among populations that blame French conscription for their sons' deaths in Russian snow and German mud. At Orgon, mobs hang the exile in effigy, while shouting curses that would have earned execution during years when his authority seemed unshakable. The conqueror of Europe disguises himself as an Austrian officer to avoid lynching by subjects who welcomed his rule when it brought them glory. HMS Undaunted waits at Fréjus, the same port where Bonaparte had landed in triumph after Egyptian adventures that launched his rise to supreme power. British sailors, expecting to meet the ogre of revolutionary propaganda, find instead a middle-aged man whose corpulence and pallor reflect the stress of defending an empire against impossible odds. Captain Thomas Ulcer discovers that his prisoner discusses navigation intelligently and inquires about crew families with genuine interest. May 4th, 1814, marks the exiles' arrival at Portoferraio, Elba's capital, where a population that barely exceeds the strength of a single French regiment greets their new sovereign with curiosity rather than enthusiasm. The harbour that receives him can accommodate fishing boats rather than fleets, while the palace assigned for his residence would fit comfortably inside a wing of Fontainebleau or the Tuileries. The Bourbon Restoration proceeds in Paris as Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king, returns from 23 years of exile to reclaim his ancestral throne. The new monarch's promises of constitutional rule and national reconciliation seem genuine, yet émigrés who accompany him demand restoration of properties and privileges that revolutionary legislation had abolished permanently. Veterans discharged on half pay discover that their service means nothing to authorities who regard Republican history as an unfortunate episode best forgotten entirely. Prisoners of war returning from British hulks and Russian camps find unemployment and indifference, where they expected gratitude and recognition. In shabby cafes, retired soldiers speak longingly of campaigns when French arms made Europe tremble. On his island principality, the former emperor governs 12,000 subjects with the same energy he once applied to Continental Empire, his reforms improving roads and mining operations while demonstrating that exile cannot diminish administrative genius that had reorganized European civilization. Yet letters from France report growing discontent with Bourbon rule, while intelligence suggests that Allied powers consider relocating him to more remote imprisonment. The Congress of Vienna proceeds with diplomatic deliberation that reflects great powers' determination to prevent future military adventures by controlling every variable that might enable another revolutionary leader to threaten European stability. Delegates who had fled his armies now divide territories he once governed, their negotiations revealing how completely the balance has shifted from French dominance to Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and British cooperation. As 1814 ends, the man who began the year as master of continental Europe contemplates Mediterranean horizons from windows that overlook domains smaller than many estates he once possessed. Behind him lies the wreckage of 20 years' ambition, while ahead stretches an uncertain future that may offer redemption, or merely the tedium of comfortable imprisonment among people who remember his glory only through stories their parents tell. Restless reflection grips the exile as news spreads of French frustration with a monarchy that cannot meet its promises. The eagle may be confined, but confinement was never its destiny. What seemed a final act at Fontainebleau may prove only an intermission, with scenes still to play that astonish both friend and foe. Mediterranean winds rattle the windows of Napoleon's modest palace on Elba as he reaches his decision, 10 months of gilded captivity, convincing him that exile brings no rest to one who once steered the destinies of nations. Smuggled letters speak of France's growing discontent with Bourbon rule, while intelligence warns that the Allies intend to send him to distant Saint Helena, a lonely volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, from which escape would be unthinkable. The British commissioner charged with monitoring the fallen emperor has developed unfortunate habits that will cost his government dearly. Sir Neil Campbell's frequent visits to his Italian mistress on the mainland leave surveillance gaps that a man of Bonaparte's calculating intelligence cannot help but notice. On February 26th, while Campbell pursues romance in Livorno, the most closely watched prisoner in European history slips anchor aboard the brig Inconstant. March 1st, 1815, Gulf Juan, near Cannes. The greatest adventure in European political history begins with 1,100 men wading through surf onto beaches where Roman legions once landed to conquer Gaul. The enterprise seems insane. 1,000 soldiers against every army in Europe. An exiled emperor against every crowned head from London to St. Petersburg. Every probability is tallied with exactness, informed by confidential dispatches showing the nation's anger at a regime of empty pledges. To avoid royalist Provence, where memories of revolutionary terror still burn hot, the expedition takes the mountain route through Alpine passes that will later bear his name. The route Napoleon leads through terrain so difficult that pursuing cavalry cannot follow, while local populations who remember imperial conscription remain neutral rather than enthusiastic about any political restoration that might renew foreign wars. Every day brings fresh proof that France has not forgotten her emperor. At Sisteron, the garrison joins without firing a shot. Gap opens its gates while church bells ring, celebration rather than alarm. Most dramatically, at the village of Laffrey, the 5th Infantry Regiment blocks the road, with muskets loaded and bayonets fixed, their officers having received orders to arrest the returned exile and deliver him in chains to Paris. Bonaparte walks alone toward the levelled weapons, his small figure advancing through morning mist with theatrical courage that transforms military confrontation into political theatre. "Soldiers of the 5th, he calls, in voice that carries clearly across the tense silence. "Do you recognize me?" He opens his grey overcoat to expose his chest to their muskets. "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The spell breaks as veterans recognize the voice that once promised them glory from Egypt to Austria. "Vive l'Empereur!" erupts from ranks that had been ordered to resist, their shout echoing off mountain walls, while muskets are thrown aside and grown soldiers weep to see their chief returned from exile. The 5th Regiment becomes the first military unit to rejoin Bonaparte's cause, their defections signalling that royal authority rests on foundations more fragile than Bourbon courtiers dare acknowledge. At Grenoble, the garrison commander prepares to resist until his own troops declare for the returned eagle, whose presence seems to awaken something in French hearts that 25 years of war had failed to extinguish completely. The tricolour flag rises above ancient ramparts, while crowds sing the Marseillaise for the first time since 1814, their voices carrying across valleys where other communities hear the songs of revolution reborn. Marshal Ney receives royal orders to bring his former chief back in an iron cage, but the bravest of the brave cannot forget 20 years of shared victories that forged bonds stronger than political convenience. Reading Bonaparte's proclamation to troops who remember following the marshal's charges from Italy to Russia, Ney declares with voice that trembles with suppressed emotion, "The cause of the Bourbons is lost forever." Tomorrow I shall place myself at the head of my soldiers and march to join the emperor. The news reaches Paris like thunderbolt from cloudless skies. The tiger has broken loose from the Isle of Elba, becomes Bonaparte has landed with a handful of men. Then Napoleon approaches with a growing army. Finally, His Imperial Majesty will arrive in the capital tomorrow. In a mere 20 days, the beast becomes emperor again, not through battle, but through a momentum that exposes the Restoration's inability to command true devotion. Louis XVIII, the Bourbon monarch, whose promises of constitutional rule had seemed genuine, discovers that royal authority means nothing when faced with popular enthusiasm for returned greatness. At midnight on March 19th, the fat king flees Paris in a travelling carriage, while his courtiers scramble to escape France before Bonaparte's supporters can settle accounts for real or imagined collaboration with foreign powers. 20 hours after the royal departure, Napoleon enters the Tuileries, carried on supporters' shoulders, through crowds that fill every street between the city gates and the palace, where he will resume imperial authority. The journey from Elba has taken exactly 100 days and cost not a single life in combat, its success proving that some loyalties transcend political calculation when they touch deeper sources of national pride. This is not the Napoleon of 1804, drunk on conquest and convinced of his own invincibility. The returned emperor proclaims himself a constitutional monarch, promises free elections and press freedom, invites liberal opponents to help draft new governmental structures. Benjamin Constant, who had opposed imperial tyranny with pen and voice, finds himself summoned to collaborate on the additional act that will transform French autocracy into limited monarchy. I am no longer a conqueror, Bonaparte declares to audiences that remember when his word was law from the Atlantic to the Elbe. I want nothing but the happiness and glory of France. The transformation seems genuine, though skeptics wonder whether leopards can change their spots, or eagles learn to perch contentedly in gilded cages designed by constitutional theorists. At the Congress of Vienna, delegates are literally dancing when courier gallops arrive with news that shatters the diplomatic festival. The man they had exiled to comfortable irrelevance has escaped and reconquered France through popular acclaim rather than military force. Panic gives way to grim determination, as plenipotentiaries who had been dividing his former empire unite to destroy the threat his mere existence represents to European stability. The Seventh Coalition forms with unprecedented speed and unity of purpose. On March 13th, before Napoleon even reaches Paris, the assembled powers declare him an outlaw, an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world. There will be no negotiations, no compromises, no recognition of any government he might establish. This ends only with Bonaparte dead, permanently exiled, or crushed so completely that his name becomes a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. Britain pledges £5 million in subsidies, while promising that Royal Navy squadrons will enforce absolute blockade of French ports. Prussia mobilizes the Landwehr that had helped destroy the Grande Armée at Leipzig. Austria contributes armies, commanded by generals who learned their trade fighting imperial forces across a dozen European battlefields. Russia sends veteran regiments that remember burning Moscow rather than surrendering it to foreign occupation. Most ominous of all, the coalition's 1 million men tower over anything the emperor can muster from a land drained by 2 decades of ceaseless war. The mathematics that had doomed the 1814 campaign appear even more hopeless now, with enemies who possess overwhelming numerical superiority combined with professional competence that previous coalitions had lacked. Napoleon needs 800,000 men, to defend France against invasion from every direction. He has barely 200,000, many of them veterans whose enthusiasm for renewed conflict must compete with war weariness that affects entire families. The levée en masse that once summoned 750,000 citizens to defend revolutionary principles now produces only reluctant compliance from populations that have given enough sons to foreign battlefields. Conscription attempts fail throughout rural districts where mayors report that young men have simply vanished rather than report to recruiting stations. The National Guard, supposedly 300,000 strong on paper, provides perhaps 100,000 poorly trained men whose loyalty depends on circumstances that may not favor sustained resistance when professional armies appear on French soil. For his mobile striking force, Bonaparte assembles the Army of the North, 124,000 men who represent the best France can offer from limited resources. Many are veterans whose experience spans every European battlefield, but hasty organization prevents the systematic training that had made imperial armies superior to any opponents. Critical shortages in experienced officers reflect the reality that many professionals remain loyal to the Bourbon monarchy or simply refuse to risk their lives in what appears to be a hopeless enterprise. The strategic dilemma admits no easy solution. Should Napoleon wait for Allied invasion and fight defensively on French soil, or strike first, attempting to defeat enemies piecemeal before they can coordinate overwhelming attacks? Defensive warfare might preserve his forces longer, but it concedes initiative to opponents who possess every advantage except the tactical genius that has sustained his reputation through 2 decades of European conflict. In Belgium, the Duke of Wellington commands 93,000 British, Dutch, and German troops, whose quality varies dramatically, but whose core consists of peninsular veterans who have learned to defeat French tactical superiority through defensive discipline and coordinated counterattacks. These are soldiers who remember Spanish mountains and Portuguese fortifications, their confidence justified by victories that stretch from Talavera to Toulouse. Prince Gebhard von Blücher leads 117,000 Prussians, whose hatred for Napoleon exceeds their fear of his military reputation. The old field marshal, who earned the nickname Marshal Forward for his aggressive tactics, burns to avenge years of national humiliation, his officers sharing enthusiasm for campaigns that promise to eliminate forever the threat of French domination over German territories. Napoleon's decision becomes inevitable when intelligence reports reveal that Austrian and Russian armies will not reach operational areas until late summer. If he can defeat Wellington and Blücher before these reinforcements arrive, perhaps he can negotiate from strength rather than weakness. The alternative, waiting passively for overwhelming force to destroy him, offers no possibility of survival for the empire he has restored through popular acclaim. On June 12th, the emperor leaves Paris, fully aware that he stakes everything on one last throw of the dice. Before the assembly, he proclaims a fight for French independence against enemies who scorn the people's voice. The language recalls the revolution, yet he understands all too well that failure now means death, not banishment. The Army of the North concentrates near the Belgian frontier, while its commander studies maps that show enemy positions, separated by distances that rapid movement might exploit. If French forces can drive a wedge between Allied armies, defeating each in turn before they unite, perhaps the impossible might become merely improbable. The strategy that conquered Europe must work one final time, or the adventure that began at Golfe-Juan will end in catastrophe that makes Leipzig seem like a minor reverse. As summer approaches, Napoleon commands forces inferior in number, equipment, and strategic position to enemies who have learned from 20 years of defeat at his hands. Yet something in the French response to his return suggests that national pride remains a weapon more powerful than foreign gold or professional armies. The question that will determine European destiny is whether pride alone can overcome the mathematics that favor his opponents so completely. The eagle has returned to his element, but the skies are filled with hunters, whose combined strength may finally prove sufficient to bring down the bird whose flight has dominated European warfare for a generation. The 100 Days approach their climax in Belgian fields, where the fate of revolutionary France will face its ultimate test against the forces of monarchical Europe. French forces cross the Belgian frontier at Charleroi in complete surprise, Napoleon's armies driving a wedge between Wellington and Blucher before either Allied commander realizes that the campaign they expected to begin in July has already commenced. Republican columns pour across the Sambre River like a torrent breaking through a dam. Their advance so rapid that enemy outposts are overwhelmed before they can send warning messages to headquarters sleeping peacefully in Brussels. At Liège, on June 16th, Bonaparte personally commands 70,000 veterans against 83,000 Prussians under Prince Gebhard von Blücher. Victory comes when imperial artillery concentrates on the village centre, turning buildings into funeral pyres, while the 72-year-old Prussian warrior falls beneath his wounded horse. Yet triumph proves incomplete when the Prussians retreat northward toward Wellington, rather than eastward towards safety, keeping alive the possibility of junction that Bonaparte must prevent. Marshal Michel Ney fails to capture the crossroads at Quatre Bras, despite commanding superior forces, his procrastination costing the French a strategic opportunity that aggressive action might have exploited decisively. Count d'Erlon's corps marches between both battlefields, participating effectively in neither as confused orders send 20,000 men on pointless maneuvers between the two engagements. Torrential rain transforms Belgian roads into rivers of mud, while Napoleon calculates whether to pursue the defeated Prussians or concentrate against Wellington, whose forces retreat toward positions near the village of Waterloo. The night becomes an ordeal of endurance that tests veteran discipline, as soldiers huddle in squares that provide no shelter from Belgian rain that soaks through uniforms and fills musket barrels with water. Napoleon, suffering from hemorrhoids and possible cystitis, moves more slowly than campaigns require when minutes determine strategic outcomes. The emperor, who once covered impossible distances through personal example, now delegates reconnaissance to subordinates whose reports cannot substitute for direct observation. Dawn reveals two armies deployed across terrain that seems designed for decisive battle. Wellington commands 68,000 men, positioned along ridges that provide natural protection from artillery. His forces, including Peninsular veterans, whose experience spans 6 years of fighting French armies. The Duke positions his weakest troops in rear areas, while placing veterans where fighting will prove most severe. The rain stops, but the ground remains sodden, forcing Napoleon to delay attack until 11:30 a.m., while waiting for terrain to dry sufficiently for artillery effectiveness. The delay grants Prussians precious hours to march from Wavre toward the sound of guns that will guide their approach. 80 Republican guns concentrate fire on positions they cannot see clearly, their iron balls bouncing through Wellington's ranks, seeking targets that remain largely invisible behind terrain features. For 1 hour, the bombardment achieves little against an enemy that understands defensive warfare. The attack on Hougoumont Farm begins as diversion, but becomes obsession, consuming French resources throughout the day. A handful of guards companies ties down 14,000 Republican soldiers in combat that serves no strategic purpose. Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonnell personally slams shut the chateau gates when assault troops briefly penetrate the courtyard, his individual action preventing tactical success that might have unhinged Wellington's entire right flank. Count d'Erlon's grand assault at 1:30 p.m. sends 16,000 infantry advancing in massive columns toward British positions. Drums beat the pas de charge, while eagles glint in afternoon sunlight, the spectacle magnificent as professional soldiers march toward enemies whose defensive positions should crumble before such force. But British tactics, perfected through Spanish campaigns, transform French numerical advantage into tactical liability. Two deep lines pour controlled volleys into column fronts that cannot deploy quickly enough to return effective fire. Sir Thomas Picton's division holds despite overwhelming odds until British heavy cavalry arrives to complete the repulse. The Scots Greys and Royal Dragoons charge downhill with sabres that catch sunlight as they slice through infantry formations. D'Erlon's corps dissolves under cavalry attack that captures regimental eagles, yet British horsemen pursue too far and suffer devastating counterattack from French lancers. Marshal Ney's cavalry charges at 3:30 p.m. represent either supreme innovation or strategic desperation. 5,000 horsemen surge around Wellington's right centre in attacks that continue for 2 hours without result. English infantry forms squares, human fortresses bristling with bayonets that horses cannot penetrate despite repeated attempts. Ney has 12 horses shot from under him, while leading charges that achieve nothing except demonstrating that cavalry alone cannot break properly formed infantry. Wellington watches from inside a square as wave after wave mills helplessly around formations that bend but never break. Magnificent, but not war, the Duke observes with professional admiration. French capture of La Haye-Sainte Farm at 6 p.m. enables Republican artillery to advance within canister range of Wellington's line, their guns firing directly into formations that have withstood every previous attack. For crucial minutes, Allied defeat seems inevitable, as concentrated fire tears gaps in ranks, while panic begins spreading through units that have endured hours of combat. Yet Prussian forces begin appearing on French flanks, their presence transforming Napoleon's tactical problem from difficult to impossible. Blucher's advance guards engage Plancenoit, while main bodies continue arriving, their numbers growing hourly as German columns follow cannon, fire toward battlefields where European destiny hangs in balance. Napoleon's final gamble comes at 7:30 p.m. as the Imperial Guard advances in columns that represent the last reserve of an empire built on military success. 3,000 veterans who have never known defeat march up the slope toward British positions, their bearskin caps visible above bayonets that have conquered from Madrid to Moscow. But Wellington has repositioned during the cavalry attacks, placing Maitland's Guards Brigade behind the ridge crest where French reconnaissance cannot detect their presence. At 50 yards, the Duke appears. "Now, Maitland! Now's your time. Up guards. Make ready. Fire." 1,500 muskets discharge simultaneously into column fronts that expect to find demoralized enemies. The Imperial Guard staggers under volleys that strike from 3 directions, as British Guardsmen, Dutch infantry, and Adams' brigade coordinate fires that no formation can withstand. The impossible occurs as Bonaparte's elite reserve retreats in disorder, their withdrawal spreading panic through ranks that have never seen these veterans defeated. Wellington recognizes that enemy morale has finally cracked beyond recovery. Waving his hat above his head, the Duke orders general advance by forces that have endured 9 hours of combat without yielding decisive advantage. The French army dissolves into panic-stricken flight as formations disintegrate under pressure that combines physical exhaustion with psychological shock. Only 3 guard squares maintain formation during the retreat, dying where they stand rather than abandoning honor that military catastrophe cannot destroy. General Pierre Cambronne, commanding the last square, receives surrender demands with legendary response. The guard dies but does not surrender. Night falls on carnage that leaves 65,000 casualties scattered across 3 square miles of Belgian farmland. Wellington surveys the battlefield at dawn, his own losses so severe that victory tastes like defeat. Nothing except a battle lost, he observes, can be half so melancholy as a battle won. At La Belle Alliance, Wellington and Blücher meet in triumph that completes the campaign Bonaparte had hoped would restore his empire through single victory. The Prussians' arrival with fresh troops had decided the battle's outcome, his perseverance demonstrating that strategic cooperation can overcome individual tactical genius. Napoleon's coach is captured containing diamonds worth millions, and his copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, while the emperor himself escapes on horseback toward Charleroi. Behind him, the Grande Armée ceases to exist as an organized force, its dissolution marking not only the end of the 100 Days, but the final collapse of imperial ambitions that had dominated European politics for 25 years. The battle that was meant to restore French dominance instead ensures its permanent elimination from European politics. Waterloo becomes the graveyard not only of imperial dreams, but of revolutionary hopes that had sustained French expansion since 1792. The adventure that began at Golfe Juan ends in Belgian mud, where eagles learn that even they cannot fly forever against the combined winds of an aroused continent. The second abdication comes without the theatrical drama that marked the first surrender at Fontainebleau. Napoleon's signature on parchment, representing simple acknowledgement that Waterloo has ended forever, his dreams of restored empire. The 100 Days collapse into ignominious flight as coalition armies converge on a capital that no longer cheers for the returned eagle, whose wings have been definitively clipped by Belgian mud and Prussian bayonets. 4 days after the battle, Bonaparte reaches Paris to discover that political support has evaporated faster than morning mist in summer sunshine. The Chamber of Deputies demands immediate abdication, while crowds that had welcomed his return now whisper that perhaps the Bourbons offered stability that imperial adventures cannot provide. Without an army to enforce his will, the emperor becomes merely another politician whose credibility depends on popular support that military disaster has destroyed. Fleeing toward the Atlantic coast, the fallen ruler contemplates options that grow fewer with each passing hour. American exile seems possible if British cruisers can be avoided, while various schemes propose escape through smuggling networks that had once defied the Continental system's enforcement. Yet reality intrudes upon fantasy, as reports arrive describing Allied armies advancing on every route that might lead to sanctuary beyond European reach. HMS Bellerophon anchors off Rochefort like a floating prison, whose captain holds keys to Bonaparte's uncertain future. Surrender to British authority offers the only alternative to capture by Prussian forces, whose justice would prove less merciful than English law. I come to throw myself upon the protection of your laws, Napoleon declares to Captain Frederick Maitland, still imagining that liberal principles might permit comfortable retirement in English countryside, where he could write memoirs and offer advice to governments that once feared his power. British government calculations prove less generous than their prisoner's optimism suggests possible. Napoleon's presence in England would attract radical sympathizers whose enthusiasm might threaten domestic tranquility, while his proximity to European politics could inspire fresh conspiracies among populations that have not forgotten the glory his name once represented. The solution requires distance measured in thousands rather than hundreds of miles, isolation that prevents any possibility of renewed influence over continental affairs. The announcement strikes like physical blow when officials inform their captive that St. Helena will provide his permanent residence. The volcanic island rises from South Atlantic waters, 1,200 miles from the nearest land, its position ensuring that escape becomes impossible without resources that no conspiracy could provide. Portuguese navigators discovered this rocky speck 3 centuries earlier, yet it remains unknown to most Europeans who have never had reason to study maps of waters so remote from civilized society. After a 10-week voyage aboard HMS Northumberland, the island prison appears on the horizon like a black fortress designed by Providence to confine dangerous ambitions within natural boundaries that human guards could never maintain so effectively. Cliffs rise sheer from ocean depths, while a single road winds upward through valleys where British sentries watch every approach to the Highland Plateau that will contain the most closely guarded prisoner in world history. Longwood House becomes the center of a universe reduced from continental empire to domestic routine, managed by servants who remember when their master's orders reshaped European civilization. The dwelling itself reflects British parsimony rather than imperial dignity. Damp rooms with peeling wallpaper, furniture that breaks under normal use, gardens where Atlantic winds destroy every plant that attempts to grow in soil too poor to sustain anything except the hardiest vegetation. Governor Hudson Lowe embodies petty tyranny that transforms imprisonment into personal torment through systematic application of regulations designed to demonstrate that fallen emperors deserve no more courtesy than common criminals. The colonial administrator insists on calling his prisoner General Bonaparte, rather than acknowledging imperial titles that British policy refuses to recognize, while restricting movements beyond arbitrary boundaries that serve no security purpose except humiliating a man who once commanded from Madrid to Moscow. From his study overlooking valleys, where British soldiers drill in formations borrowed from tactics that Wellington perfected during peninsular campaigns, Bonaparte dictates memoirs that will reshape European understanding of the revolutionary wars that dominated a generation's experience. His accounts transform every defeat into strategic necessity, while portraying every harsh measure as reluctant response to circumstances beyond any ruler's control. The man who had manipulated European politics now manipulates historical memory with equal skill. Daily routine provides structure for minds threatened by the tedium of comfortable imprisonment among people who speak a language the exile never learned fluently. Morning dictation to secretaries who struggle to record thoughts that flow faster than pens can capture them, followed by meals where imperial etiquette maintains dignity that circumstances constantly undermine. Afternoons bring walks within boundaries that centuries enforce with military precision, while evenings offer conversations with companions whose company grows stale through repetition. The legend grows stronger in exile than it ever was during years of actual power, as accounts published in European capitals present Bonaparte as martyred genius, whose greatness was destroyed by enemies too small to comprehend the vision that might have united the continent under enlightened leadership. The Memorial of St. Helena becomes continental bestseller, while its author remains confined to an island whose population barely exceeds a single regiment's strength. Las Cases, the most literary of the exile's companions, publishes conversations that portray their subject as philosopher king, whose military achievements were merely means to achieve lasting peace through European federation. These romanticized accounts ignore the millions who died in wars that served primarily to satisfy one man's ambition, yet they capture imaginations hungry for heroes, whose stature transcends ordinary political calculation. Physical decline accompanies intellectual productivity as the prisoner's health deteriorates under conditions that combine tropical climate with persistent dampness that penetrates buildings designed for temporary occupation rather than permanent residence. Stomach ailments that may represent cancer or arsenic poisoning. Historians still debate the cause, create constant discomfort that transforms simple activities into ordeals of endurance. Years pass with mechanical regularity as the exile's world contracts from rooms to bed, from daily walks to occasional movements between chair and window, from dictated memoirs to whispered conversations with servants who have remained loyal through circumstances that would excuse any abandonment. The man who once traveled from Paris to Moscow now measures distances in steps between furniture pieces that represent the boundaries of his shrinking universe. Visitors who brave Atlantic voyages to glimpse the caged eagle discover a middle-aged man whose corpulence and pallor reflect years of inactivity, yet whose conversation still displays the intellectual energy that once mesmerized diplomats and generals. European celebrities make pilgrimages to Longwood House, their accounts describing encounters with living history, whose legend has already exceeded the reality of his actual achievements. The end approaches with symptoms that puzzle doctors, whose remedies seem inadequate for ailments that resist conventional treatment. Stomach pain increases while appetite disappears. Weight loss becomes visible, even through clothes designed to conceal physical deterioration. An energy that once sustained 18-hour workdays now barely supports brief conversations with attendants who watch their master fade like candlelight, guttering in Atlantic winds. His final words remain disputed by witnesses whose accounts reflect their own needs more than historical accuracy. France, army, head of the army, or Josephine serve different purposes for those who would memorialize the exile's last thoughts. Yet all agree that death comes quietly on an afternoon when South Atlantic storms batter the island with rain that drums against windows like bullets striking glass. The funeral combines imperial ceremony with colonial practicality, as British officials permit honors due to fallen greatness while maintaining security precautions that prevent any demonstration of political sympathy. Local residents who had grown accustomed to their famous prisoner gather at graveside where willows planted by the exile's own hands provide shade for marble headstone, whose inscription lists neither birth nor death dates, only the single word Napoleon that requires no further identification. Burial in island soil that will hold his remains for 19 years provides time for European passions to cool, while his legend continues growing through publications that transform the man into myth suitable for inspiring future generations. The rocky grave becomes pilgrimage destination for visitors who cross oceans to pay respects at the tomb of someone whose name epitomizes both revolutionary possibility and imperial excess. When King Louis-Philippe orders the return of the ashes in 1840, political calculation combines with genuine sentiment to create national celebration that transforms former enemy into French patrimony, worthy of monuments and commemorative ceremonies. 1 million Parisians line December streets to witness procession that carries the exile's remains toward tomb in Les Invalides, where visitors can still contemplate the career that began with artillery tables and ended in Atlantic isolation. The sarcophagus of red porphyry that holds his remains reflects ambitions whose scale matched their ultimate failure, while the circular crypt that surrounds it suggests both grandeur and confinement, appropriate for a life that spanned triumph and catastrophe with equal intensity. Tourists who descend marble steps to view the tomb encounter history made tangible, the physical presence of mortality that even genius cannot transcend. St. Helena's role as prison ended when its most famous resident died, yet the island's significance in European memory continues as symbol of how completely fortune can reverse the seemingly permanent achievements that ambitious men create through force and intelligence. The Atlantic rock that seemed like world's end to its imperial prisoner became the launching point for legends that prove more durable than any territorial conquest that armies might achieve through battlefield success.